Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The rain started as a whisper against the windshield somewhere past the county line, where the highway narrowed from 4 lanes down to 2, and the streetlights gave way to long stretches of darkness broken only by the occasional reflective mile marker. Amos Rutledge had been driving this route for 11 years, hauling refrigerated goods from the distribution center in Oakdale to the supermarket chains scattered across 3 counties, and he knew the road the way some men knew their own backyards. He knew which curves tightened up without warning, which overpasses flooded first when the storms rolled through, and which rest stops had the cleanest bathrooms and the strongest coffee. The knowledge came from repetition, from thousands of miles logged in all kinds of weather, and it gave him a confidence that newer drivers lacked. But tonight felt different from the moment he pulled out of the loading dock. The air had that heavy, expectant quality that came before serious weather, and the sky to the west glowed with distant lightning that never seemed to get any closer or any farther away. The dispatcher had mentioned flash flood warnings for the valley, but warnings were common this time of year when late September storms moved through the region like freight trains, dumping weeks' worth of rain in a matter of hours. Amos had driven through plenty of storms. This one would be no different. Or so he told himself as he merged onto the highway and pointed his rig north. The rain arrived in earnest around Junction City, just past the way station where he'd stopped to check his load straps and grab a lukewarm coffee from the vending machine. It came down in sheets so thick that his wipers, even on the highest setting, could barely keep up. The road ahead seemed to dissolve into the darkness, the white lane markers flickering in and out of visibility as water pooled across both lanes. His CB radio crackled with static and brief, garbled transmissions from other drivers, warnings about standing water near mile marker 198, reports of a jackknifed trailer near the county line, someone asking about detour routes that nobody seemed to have answers for. Amos adjusted the volume on the CB and kept his speed steady at 45, his eyes fixed on the road with the kind of focus that came from experience and a healthy respect for physics. A loaded 18-wheeler didn't stop on a dime in good weather, and in conditions like these, with water sheeting across the pavement and visibility reduced to almost nothing, every decision had to be calculated and deliberate. He'd seen too many wrecks caused by drivers who thought they could maintain highway speed in a downpour, who didn't understand that their tires could only displace so much water before they started hydroplaning. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when he first noticed something odd. Up ahead, maybe half a mile out, he could see a faint amber glow through the rain. It pulsed in a steady rhythm, on, off, on, off, the unmistakable pattern of hazard lights. Someone had pulled over, or maybe broken down. It happened all the time in weather like this. Electrical systems got wet, engines flooded, transmissions overheated. The smart move was to get off the road and wait for help rather than trying to limp along and creating a hazard for other drivers. Amos eased off the accelerator and reached for his CB handset, thumbing the button to broadcast on Channel 19. His voice came out calm and practiced, the tone of someone who'd made thousands of similar calls over the years. "This is northbound rig at mile marker 212. Got a vehicle with hazards on up ahead. Anyone know what's going on?" Static answered him, then a brief squelch, then more static. He tried again, rephrasing the question, asking if anyone had reported a breakdown in this area, but the radio offered nothing but white noise punctuated by odd clicks and pops that sounded almost deliberate, almost like Morse code, though he knew it was just the storm interfering with the signal. Heavy rain could bend radio waves in strange directions, could bounce them off water particles in the air and create echoes and distortions that made communication nearly impossible. He hung the handset back on its clip and focused on the road, watching the amber lights grow clearer as he approached. They were positioned right at the edge of the breakdown lane, exactly where a disabled vehicle should be. But something about them seemed wrong, though he couldn't immediately identify what was bothering him. Maybe it was the spacing. The lights looked too far apart, as if they were on something larger than a standard car or pickup truck. Or maybe it was the way they seemed to float in the darkness, disconnected from any visible structure. Amos squinted through the rain-streaked windshield, trying to make out the shape of the vehicle itself, but the darkness and the downpour turned everything beyond his headlight beams into an indistinct blur. The rain was coming down so hard now that it created a kind of visual static, a curtain of water that obscured details and played tricks with depth perception. He'd learned long ago not to trust his eyes completely in conditions like these, when shadows could look like solid objects and reflections could masquerade as real things. He was less than 200 yards away when his high beams finally caught something solid, a dark shape on the shoulder, low to the ground. Not a car, not a truck, nothing he could immediately identify. The hazard lights blinked on again, and for just a moment, Amos thought he saw movement near them, a flicker of something pale against the wet asphalt. Then the lights went dark again, and when they came back on, the shape was gone. A cold knot formed in his stomach, the kind of instinctive unease that had kept him safe over 11 years of driving. He'd learned to trust that feeling, that subtle warning system that activated when something wasn't quite right. It had saved him from bad situations more times than he could count. Sketchy truck stops where he'd decided not to park. Rest areas that felt wrong, even though he couldn't explain why. Stretches of road where he'd slowed down moments before coming upon an accident. He slowed to 30, then 25, his hand hovering over the CB handset again. His headlights swept the shoulder as he approached the spot where the hazards had been, and in the brief second before he passed it, he saw the reflective marker post for mile marker 214. The number gleamed in his headlights, bright and official, exactly where it should be. The shoulder beyond it was empty. No vehicle, no debris, no signs of a breakdown or an accident. Just rain and darkness and wet pavement. Amos looked in his side mirror as he rolled past, and his breath caught in his throat. The hazard lights were still there, still flashing, but they were behind him now. He could see them clearly in the mirror, amber and insistent, pulsing in the rain exactly where he'd just driven past. They marked a spot where there was nothing, where his headlights had revealed only empty road and the reflective mile marker. He touched his brakes, considering whether to stop and investigate, but something, instinct maybe, or just common sense honed by years on the road, told him to keep moving. The lights in his mirror continued to flash, and he forced himself to look away, to focus on the road ahead. Whatever was happening back there, whatever he'd seen or thought he'd seen, wasn't worth stopping for. Not in this weather. Not in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal and no backup. The CB crackled to life without warning, making him flinch hard enough that the truck swerved slightly into the other lane before he corrected. A voice came through, distorted by static but clear enough to understand. All northbound traffic be advised. Standing water at mile marker 214. Repeat. Standing water at mile marker 214. Use caution. Amos grabbed the handset, his heart hammering now. This is northbound at 214. Road looks clear here. What's your 20? The voice came back, but this time it sounded different. Slower. The words stretched out in a way that made them seem almost inhuman. Standing water at mile marker 214. Use caution. I just passed 214, Amos said, keeping his tone patient even though anxiety was creeping up his spine. There's no standing water. You got a visual on this? Are you highway patrol? Static hissed through the speaker, and then the same message repeated, word for word, in the same slurred cadence. Standing water at mile marker 214. Use caution. Amos released the transmit button and stared at the radio. It had to be a recorded message, some kind of automated warning system the highway patrol used when the weather got bad. But he'd never heard anything like it on the CB before. Those warnings usually came through the AM stations or on the electronic highway signs, not over the trucker channels. And there was something about the voice itself that bothered him, something that didn't sound quite right, as if whoever was speaking had learned English phonetically without understanding the rhythm and flow of actual speech. He glanced in his side mirror again. The hazard lights were gone. The stretch of road behind him was dark and empty, just wet pavement reflecting his taillights and the rain falling in torrents. He looked ahead, scanning for any sign of the lights reappearing, but saw nothing except the rain and the faint glow of his headlights being swallowed by the storm. The highway curved gently to the left, following the contour of the valley, and Amos kept his speed down, watching for standing water that the voice on the radio had warned about. But the road remained passable, the water sheeting across it but not pooling deep enough to be dangerous. He'd driven through worse conditions than this, had navigated flooded intersections and submerged underpasses that had water halfway up his wheels. This was manageable. This was routine, except nothing about tonight felt routine anymore. The CB crackled again, and this time multiple voices came through, overlapping and distorted. Mile marker 214, hazards lights, standing water. Can anyone confirm? The transmissions were fragmentary, cutting in and out as if the speakers were moving in and out of range, and Amos couldn't tell if they were responding to each other or broadcasting independently. He tried to break in, tried to ask for clarification, but his own voice was drowned out by the static and the competing transmissions. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the radio went silent. Not just quiet, but completely dead, as if someone had unplugged it. The static cut off mid-burst, leaving only the sound of rain hammering on the roof of the cab and the steady rhythm of the wipers scraping across the windshield. Amos toggled the volume knob, checked the power connection, even switched channels, but nothing worked. The radio was completely unresponsive. He was about to reach for his cell phone when the headlights of another vehicle appeared in his rearview mirror. Relief flooded through him. At least he wasn't alone out here. Another driver, probably as confused and anxious as he was, probably trying to make sense of the same weird warnings and the same phantom hazard lights. Amos watched the headlights approach, expecting them to settle into a following distance, but instead they kept coming, getting closer and closer until they were right on his bumper, so close that the glare filled his mirrors and made it hard to see anything else. "Back off," Amos muttered, though he knew the other driver couldn't hear him. He tapped his brakes lightly, flashing his taillights in a universal signal to give him some space, but the vehicle behind him didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed to get closer, the headlights blazing so bright that Amos had to adjust his mirrors to deflect the glare. His pulse quickened. This wasn't normal following behavior. This was aggressive, deliberate, the kind of tailgating that suggested intent rather than carelessness. He thought about accelerating, pulling away from whoever was behind him, but the road conditions were too dangerous for that. One wrong move, one patch of standing water hit at the wrong angle, and his truck could jackknife or hydroplane off the road entirely. The vehicle behind him flashed its high beams, once, twice, 3 times, and Amos felt his stomach drop. That wasn't a random signal, that was communication, though he had no idea what message was being conveyed. He reached for his CB handset again, hoping the radio had come back online, but it remained stubbornly silent. The headlights dropped back suddenly, creating distance between his truck and the vehicle behind him. and Amos exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Maybe it had just been a confused driver, someone who'd gotten too close without realizing it. Maybe. The amber hazard lights appeared again, this time directly in front of him, maybe 50 yards ahead. They materialized out of the rain and darkness as if they'd been there all along, just waiting for him to catch up. Amos's hands tightened on the wheel, and he felt sweat break out on his forehead despite the cool air from the vents. This wasn't possible. He'd passed mile marker 214 several minutes ago. He'd been driving steadily north, maintaining his speed, following the highway as it curved through the valley. There was no way those lights could be in front of him again unless they weren't tied to a specific location, unless they were moving, or unless distance and direction had stopped meaning what they should mean. The lights pulsed in their steady rhythm, and as Amos drew closer, he could see them more clearly now. They definitely weren't attached to any vehicle he could see. They hung in the air at roughly the height where taillights should be, but there was nothing beneath them, no chassis, no wheels, no solid structure. Just the lights themselves, amber and insistent, marking nothing and warning of nothing. He was almost parallel with them when he noticed the water. It appeared suddenly, spreading across both lanes in a sheet that caught his headlights and reflected them back like a mirror. This was the standing water the voice had warned about, and it was deep, maybe 6 inches, maybe more, enough to cause serious problems if he hit it at the wrong speed or the wrong angle. Amos braked carefully, feeling the truck slow, feeling the weight of the trailer pushing against the cab as momentum tried to keep everything moving forward. The water got deeper as he approached, and he could see debris floating in it. Branches, leaves, what looked like a traffic cone tumbling in the current. This wasn't just runoff from the storm. This was water that had been accumulating, that had overwhelmed the drainage systems and turned the highway into a temporary river. The hazard lights continued to pulse, and now Amos understood what they were marking. Not a vehicle, not an accident, but the water itself, the hazard that stretched across the road. Someone, or something, was warning him, guiding him, trying to keep him from driving blind into a flood zone that could swallow his truck. But who, and how? The vehicle behind him appeared in his mirrors again, its headlights cutting through the rain, and Amos realized with a start that it had stopped when he stopped, maintaining the same distance, mirroring his movements. He couldn't make out what kind of vehicle it was. The rain and the glare made it impossible to see details, but it was there, solid and real as the water spreading across the road ahead. Amos put his truck in neutral and set the parking brake, his mind racing through options. He could try to push through the water, trusting his weight and his four-wheel drive to carry him across. But if the water was deeper than it looked, if there was a washout beneath the surface, or if the current was strong enough, he could end up stalled in the middle of the flood with water rising around his cab and no way to call for help. Or he could turn around, try to find another route, backtrack to Junction City and wait out the storm at the truck stop there. But the vehicle behind him blocked that option. He couldn't turn a 53-foot rig around on a 2-lane highway without space, and whoever was behind him wasn't giving him room to maneuver. The hazard lights blinked off, stayed dark for 3 full seconds, then blinked back on. Then they went dark again, and when they returned, they'd moved. They were to the right now, closer to the shoulder, as if indicating a path, showing him where the water was shallowest, or where the road underneath was still intact. Amos stared at the lights, trying to understand what he was seeing. They were guiding him, leading him through the flood zone like marker buoys in a shipping channel. The realization should have been comforting, should have made him feel less alone out here in the storm. But instead, it filled him with a creeping dread that he couldn't quite articulate. Because hazard lights didn't move on their own. They didn't think or respond to changing conditions. They were passive warnings attached to broken-down vehicles, not intelligent guides that adapted to circumstances. Whatever he was seeing, whatever was out there in the rain and the darkness, it wasn't following any rules that he understood. The CB radio suddenly came back to life with a burst of static that made him jump. A voice emerged from the noise, not the slow, distorted voice from before, but something clearer, more human. "Northbound traffic at 214, do you copy? This is Highway Patrol, do you copy?" Amos grabbed the handset so fast he nearly dropped it. "This is northbound at 214, I copy. I've got standing water across both lanes and I don't know if I can get through." "Negative," the voice came back, crisp and professional. "Do not attempt to cross. We've got water over the road from mile marker 213 to 216. We're closing this section. You need to turn around and—" The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by the slow, inhuman voice from before. "Standing water at mile marker 214. Use caution. Proceed with caution. Use extreme caution." The words repeated, looping over each other, and Amos realized that there were multiple voices now, all saying the same thing but slightly out of sync, creating a discordant chorus that made his skin crawl. He released the transmit button and set the handset down, his hands shaking. The headlights behind him flashed again, 3 times, then twice, then 3 times more, a pattern, a code. Someone trying to communicate something specific, though Amos had no idea what message they were trying to convey. The amber hazard lights ahead moved again, drifting further to the right, staying just at the edge of his peripheral vision. Following their guidance would mean driving onto the shoulder, onto the narrow strip of pavement that might or might not be solid, that might collapse under his weight and send his truck sliding into the ditch. But staying where he was meant sitting in the middle of a flood zone with water rising and another vehicle pressing close behind him, and voices on the CB telling him things that couldn't possibly be true. All the options were bad. All the choices led to places he didn't want to go. Amos made his decision. He released the parking brake, put the truck back in gear, and edged forward toward the water, following the path the amber lights seemed to be marking. The tires met the water with a sound like tearing fabric, and the truck shuddered as resistance increased. Water sprayed up from the wheels, catching in his headlights and creating patterns that looked almost like reaching hands, like figures standing in the flood with arms outstretched. He kept his speed steady, feeling the road beneath him through the steering wheel, feeling for any indication that the pavement was giving way or that the current was pushing him sideways. The water was deep, deeper than he'd thought, and it rose to cover his wheel wells, brown and churning with debris. Something large bumped against his front bumper, and he prayed it was just a log or a section of fence and not something that could puncture a tire or damage his steering. The amber lights continued to guide him, staying just ahead and to the right, marking a path through the flood that seemed impossible but was somehow real. Amos followed them because he had no other choice, because stopping meant drowning, and turning back meant collision, and sitting still meant waiting for the water to rise high enough to stall his engine and trap him in the cab. The headlights behind him followed at the same steady distance, neither closing the gap nor falling back, maintaining a presence that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. At least he wasn't alone. At least someone else was out here, navigating the same impossible situation, making the same desperate choices. The water began to recede after what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The road beneath him grew more solid. The resistance decreased, and his tires found purchase on pavement that wasn't submerged. Amos exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath for most of the crossing, and allowed himself a moment of relief. But only a moment, because as his truck emerged from the flood zone, as the water level dropped back to something manageable, the amber hazard lights ahead went dark one final time, and didn't return. They vanished as completely as if they'd never existed, leaving only the rain and the darkness and the uncertain road ahead. And when Amos checked his rearview mirror, the headlights that had been following him were gone too. The road behind him was empty, just wet pavement and falling rain and nothing else. No other vehicle. No proof that anyone had been there at all except the lingering sense of a presence, the feeling of being watched and guided by something he couldn't see or understand. Amos drove for another 20 minutes before his hands stopped shaking enough to trust himself with the CB handset again. The rain had lessened slightly, dropping from a torrential downpour to merely heavy, and visibility had improved just enough that he could make out the road markings without straining. The flood zone was behind him now, somewhere back in the darkness with those impossible amber lights and the phantom vehicle that had followed him through the water. Every instinct told him to keep driving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and mile marker 214, but he needed to know if what he'd experienced was real, or if exhaustion and stress had finally caught up with him in the worst possible way. He keyed the microphone and kept his voice steady, professional, the tone of a driver reporting routine road conditions rather than something that defied explanation. "This is northbound rig, just cleared the flood zone at mile marker 214. Roads are passable but use extreme caution. Water was approximately 6 to 8 inches deep across both lanes. Any highway patrol monitoring, be advised that section needs barricades." Static answered him for several long seconds, and Amos was about to try again when a different voice came through, older and gravelly, with the flat vowels of someone who'd spent their whole life in this part of the state. "Copy that, northbound. This is Lyle Pennington, Highway Patrol. You said you just came through the 214 zone?" "Affirmative," Amos replied, relief flooding through him at hearing an official response. "Crossed it maybe 20 minutes ago. Had standing water, but I made it through. You'll want to get some barriers up before someone less experienced tries it and gets stuck." There was a pause, long enough that Amos thought he'd lost the connection, before Lyle came back on. "Driver, we've had that section closed for the past hour. Barricades went up at mile marker 210 and 218. Nobody should have been able to reach the flood zone. Where exactly did you enter the highway?" Amos felt cold settle in his gut. "Junction City, way station. Came through around 11 o'clock. There were no barricades when I passed 210. Road was open." Another pause, this one even longer. When Lyle's voice returned, it carried an edge of concern that hadn't been there before. "Driver, I need you to pull over at the next safe location and wait for me. Don't go any further north. Do you copy?" "Copy," Amos said, though confusion was quickly morphing into unease. "There's a rest area coming up in about 5 miles. I'll wait there." "Negative on the rest area," Lyle said quickly. "That facility's been closed for maintenance since last Tuesday. Keep going to the truck stop at mile marker 237. I'll meet you there in 40 minutes. Amos acknowledged and hung up the handset, his mind racing. The rest area was closed? He'd driven past it 2 weeks ago, and it had been open, busy with travelers and truckers taking advantage of the clean facilities and well-lit parking. But if Lyle said it was closed, then something had changed. Just like something had changed about the barricades that should have been up but apparently weren't. At least not when Amos had driven through. The miles crawled by, each one feeling longer than the last. The rain continued its steady assault, and Amos found himself checking his mirrors obsessively, searching for those headlights that had followed him through the flood. But the road behind him remained empty, just darkness and rain and the occasional reflective marker post catching his taillights. He passed mile marker 220, then 225, watching the numbers climb and trying to ignore the growing sense that something fundamental had shifted. that the road he was traveling wasn't quite the same road he'd been on an hour ago. Mile marker 230 appeared and vanished, and Amos noticed something odd about the landscape. The trees that should have been dense and close to the road seemed sparser, more spread out, as if he'd somehow jumped forward several miles without noticing. The terrain looked wrong, too. Less hilly, more open, like he'd crossed into a different climate zone entirely. He checked his GPS, but the screen showed nothing but a blank map with a blinking cursor that refused to lock onto his position. The truck stop materialized out of the rain at mile marker 237, exactly where Lyle had said it would be, and Amos had never been so relieved to see electric lights and other vehicles. He pulled into the lot and counted at least a dozen other trucks, their running lights creating small islands of amber and red in the darkness. The main building glowed with fluorescent warmth, promising coffee and food and human contact. All the mundane comforts that suddenly seemed precious after the isolation of the past hour. Amos parked and killed his engine, but he didn't get out immediately. Instead, he sat in the quiet cab and tried to organize his thoughts into something coherent, something that would make sense when he had to explain it to highway patrol. He'd seen lights that weren't attached to anything. He'd driven through a flood zone that was supposed to be barricaded. He'd been followed by a vehicle that disappeared without explanation. None of it sounded reasonable when laid out in sequence, and he had no evidence beyond his own testimony and the wet clothes in his hamper that smelled of floodwater. A tap on his window made him jump hard enough to hit his head on the cab's ceiling. A man stood outside, middle-aged and weathered, wearing a highway patrol rain slicker that glistened with water. Lyle Pennington, presumably. Amos rolled down his window and was immediately hit with a blast of cool, rain-scented air. "You Rutledge?" the officer asked, and Amos nodded. "Come on inside. We need to talk, and I'd rather do it over coffee than standing in this mess." They sat in a booth near the back of the truck stop's diner, away from the handful of other drivers who were scattered throughout the space. Lyle had brought a record driver with him, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail who introduced herself as Tansy McCoy. She ordered coffee and sat quiet listening, while Lyle pulled out a worn notebook and flipped to a fresh page. "Start from the beginning," Lyle said, wrapping his hands around a mug of coffee that looked like it had been sitting on the warmer too long. "Tell me everything that happened from the moment you entered the highway." Amos did, keeping his voice level and his account as factual as possible. He described the storm, the warnings on the CB, the amber hazard lights that appeared and disappeared and reappeared in impossible locations. He told them about the voice that repeated the same message in that slow, distorted way, about the vehicle that had followed him through the flood, about the lights that had seemed to guide him to safety. He left nothing out, even the details that made him sound unreliable or confused, because he sensed that Lyle needed the complete picture, not an edited version designed to make Amos look more credible. When he finished, the diner had grown quieter, and Amos realized that several other drivers had been listening, their conversations dying away as his story unfolded. Lyle exchanged a look with Tansy, something passing between them that Amos couldn't interpret, before turning his attention back to his coffee. "The barricades were up," Lyle said finally, his voice careful. "I helped place them myself at 6 o'clock this evening. One at mile marker 210, like I said, and another at 218. Both were equipped with the standard warning signs and flashers. There's no way you could have driven past them without seeing them." "I'm telling you, there was nothing there," Amos insisted, hearing the desperation creeping into his voice and hating it. "The road was open. I drove straight through." "I believe you," Lyle said, and the simple statement caught Amos off guard. "I believe you think you drove straight through, but here's the thing. We've been getting calls all night from drivers reporting the same stretch of road. Some say the barricades are up, some say they're not. Some report seeing vehicles that aren't there when we send units to investigate. And you're the third person tonight to mention those amber lights." Tansy leaned forward, setting her coffee mug down with deliberate care. "I've been pulling vehicles out of that section for 5 years now. Tow calls, breakdowns, accidents. And I can tell you that stretch between 214 and 216 has always been problematic. Even on clear nights, we get reports of drivers seeing things that don't add up. Lights where there shouldn't be lights. Cars that vanish when you get close. CB transmissions that loop and repeat like recordings. What's causing it?" Amos asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "If we knew that, we'd have closed the whole section down," Lyle said. "Best theory right now is some kind of atmospheric phenomenon related to the storm. Temperature inversions can create mirages, make light behave in unusual ways. Add in the rain and the darkness, and drivers see things that aren't quite there, or they misinterpret things that are." But he didn't sound convinced by his own explanation, and neither was Amos. Mirages didn't guide you through flood zones. Atmospheric phenomena didn't leave your truck smelling like standing water and rotted vegetation. Something had happened out there, something real and physical that left evidence even if nobody could explain what that evidence meant. "There's something else," Lyle said, pulling a small evidence bag from his jacket pocket. Inside was a reflective safety triangle, the kind truckers use to mark disabled vehicles. "Found this at the edge of the flood zone, right about where you said you saw those amber lights. It's standard equipment, nothing unusual about it except for one thing." He turned the bag so Amos could see the triangle more clearly. Even through the plastic, he could make out dark stains on the reflective surface, patterns that looked almost deliberate. "That's not mud or road grime," Lyle continued. "Lab says it's some kind of organic residue, plant material, algae, things you'd find in stagnant water that's been sitting for months or years. But the flood only started 6 hours ago. There's no way this triangle picked up that kind of contamination in such a short time." Tansy spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "I pulled a truck out of that area 3 months ago. Driver said he'd followed hazard lights into the water, thought someone was in trouble and needed help. His engine flooded out before he realized there was no other vehicle. When I hooked up to tow him, I found one of these triangles floating in the water near his bumper. Same dark stains. Same organic residue that shouldn't have been there." "What happened to that driver?" Amos asked, though something told him he already knew the answer. "He finished his delivery, collected his pay, and quit trucking the next day," Tansy said. "Told his dispatcher he was done with the road, done with night driving, done with everything. Last I heard, he was working construction in California. Won't even talk about what happened that night." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken questions pressing down on the booth. Finally, Lyle closed his notebook and fixed Amos with a steady gaze. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to not talk about this. Not to other drivers, not to your dispatcher, not to anyone. We're trying to keep this contained while we figure out what's happening. And if word gets out, it'll cause more problems than it solves." "You're asking me to lie," Amos said flatly. "I'm asking you to be discreet," Lyle corrected. "You can report that you encountered flooding and difficult conditions. That's true. You don't need to mention the other details. And in exchange, we'll keep your name out of any reports and make sure this doesn't affect your driving record or your insurance." It was a bargain, plain and simple, and Amos understood the implicit threat beneath the polite words. Cooperate, and this goes away cleanly. Make noise, and suddenly there are questions about your fitness to drive, about whether you were impaired or experiencing some kind of medical episode that makes you a liability on the road. He'd heard stories about drivers who'd reported strange incidents only to find themselves subjected to endless evaluations and restrictions that effectively ended their careers. "Fine," he said, though the word tasted bitter. "I'll keep quiet. But I want to know something first. Those other drivers who reported the amber lights, did they all make it through safely?" The look that passed between Lyle and Tansy told him everything he needed to know before either of them spoke. "Two of them did," Lyle said carefully. "The third one didn't. We found his truck in the flood zone at mile marker 215, water up to the door handles. Driver wasn't inside. Where is he?" "We don't know," Tansy said quietly. "Search and rescue has been looking since this morning. So far, nothing. It's like he got out of his truck and walked into the water and just vanished." Amos thought about the vehicle that had followed him through the flood, the headlights that had stayed close but never quite caught up. He thought about how those lights had disappeared right after he'd cleared the water, vanishing as completely as if they'd been switched off, and he wondered, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his bones, whether that missing driver had been the one following him, whether what he'd seen had been a vehicle at all or something else entirely, something that used the shape of familiar things to navigate a world it didn't belong in. "I want to see where you found the truck," he said suddenly. "I want to see the exact location." Lyle shook his head. "Can't do that. Scene's still under investigation, and besides, there's nothing to see. Just a truck in water. Trust me, you don't need that image in your head." But Amos did need it. Needed to know if the location matched what he remembered. Needed some kind of confirmation that what he'd experienced connected to something objective and verifiable. Was it on the right side of the road or the left? "Right side," Tansy said after a moment's hesitation. "Partially on the shoulder, like the driver was trying to get out of the main lane. I was the one who towed it out this afternoon. Engine was cold, battery dead from trying to restart after it flooded. Personal belongings still in the cab, wallet, phone, everything except the driver." "And were there any other vehicles nearby, any signs of another truck or car?" "Why?" Lyle asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Because something was following me through that water," Amos said, keeping his voice low so the other drivers in the diner wouldn't overhear. "I saw headlights in my mirror the whole time I was crossing. They stayed right behind me, matching my speed, and then they disappeared as soon as I got through. If you found that truck where you say you found it, then maybe what I saw wasn't following me at all. Maybe I was seeing that driver stuck in the water, and his headlights were what I was watching in my mirror." The logic of it sounded reasonable even as he said it. A rational explanation for an irrational experience. But Lyle was already shaking his head before Amos finished speaking. "The truck we found had been there for hours before you came through. Engine was cold, battery dead. Whatever you saw behind you, it wasn't that vehicle." Amos felt something twist in his stomach. If it wasn't the stranded truck, and if there were no other vehicles reported in the area, then what had been following him? What had maintained that perfect distance, those steady headlights, that sense of presence that had been both comforting and terrifying? "There's one more thing," Lyle said, pulling out his phone and scrolling to a different image. "We found this on the dashboard of the abandoned truck. Thought you might recognize it." He turned the screen toward Amos, and what he saw made his breath catch. It was a photograph, slightly blurred but clear enough to make out the details. It showed a pair of amber hazard lights floating in darkness, disconnected from any visible vehicle, pulsing in that familiar rhythm. The timestamp on the image was from earlier that evening, roughly an hour before Amos had entered the flood zone. "The driver took that picture," Tansy explained, her voice subdued. "It was the last thing on his phone. No messages after that, no calls, nothing. Just that one image and then silence." Amos stared at the photograph. at those impossible lights that he'd followed through the water, that had guided him to safety, even as they'd apparently led someone else to their disappearance. They looked exactly as he remembered them, amber and insistent, marking something that shouldn't exist, warning of dangers that couldn't be named. "What do you think they are?" he asked quietly. Lyle took his phone back and tucked it away, his expression carefully neutral. "I think they're whatever people need them to be in that moment. For you, they were a guide. For that other driver, maybe they were something else. Or maybe," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "maybe the road itself is trying to communicate something, and those lights are the only language it knows how to use." It was the closest thing to an admission of the supernatural that Amos was likely to get from a highway patrol officer, and it was somehow more disturbing than any ghost story or urban legend. The idea that the road, just asphalt and concrete and human engineering, could develop intention, could reach out to travelers and guide them or mislead them according to some unknowable logic, violated everything he understood about how the world worked. "Can I go?" he asked, suddenly desperate to be away from this conversation, away from the implications of what he'd experienced. "I need to make my delivery, and I'm already behind schedule." Lyle nodded slowly. "Take the alternate route through Cooper's Pass. It's longer, but it's safer, at least until we figure out what's happening with that stretch of road. And remember what we talked about." "I know," Amos interrupted. "Don't talk about it. Be discreet. Keep my head down and pretend tonight was just bad weather and nothing more." Tansy walked him out to the parking lot, and as they stood beside his truck in the pre-dawn drizzle, she pulled a business card from her pocket and pressed it into his hand. "If you ever need to talk about this with someone who'll believe you, call me, day or night. Sometimes the weight of keeping quiet is worse than the thing you're keeping quiet about." Amos pocketed the card and climbed into his cab, watching Tansy walk back to the diner, her figure disappearing into the warm glow of the building. He sat there for several long minutes before starting the engine, trying to process everything he'd learned and everything he still didn't understand. The missing driver's face haunted him as he pulled out of the truck stop and headed toward the alternate route. He wondered if that driver had seen the same things, felt the same confusion and fear. He wondered if the lights had seemed like salvation right up until the moment they weren't, until they revealed themselves as something else entirely, something that took rather than guided. And he wondered, most troubling of all, whether he'd truly made it through the flood zone at all, or whether he was still there, still following those amber lights through rising water, still believing he was headed toward safety, while the road led him somewhere else entirely. 3 days passed before Amos worked up the nerve to call Tansy McCoy. He'd completed his delivery, picked up a return load, and driven back to Oakdale through the alternate route without incident. The whole trip felt surreal in retrospect, like something that had happened to someone else, and he'd almost convinced himself that the storm and the exhaustion had combined to create false memories, that what he'd experienced at mile marker 214 was nothing more than fatigue-induced hallucination dressed up in the trappings of genuine mystery. Almost convinced himself, but not quite, because every time he closed his eyes to sleep, he saw those amber lights pulsing in the darkness. Every time he heard static on the CB, his stomach clenched with the memory of that distorted voice repeating its warning. And every time he passed a flooded section of highway, he found himself checking his mirrors obsessively, searching for headlights that followed too close and disappeared too suddenly. He was sitting in his truck at a rest area outside Eugene, trying to force down a microwaved burrito that tasted like cardboard, when he finally pulled out the business card Tansy had given him. The cardstock was thick and professional, embossed with the logo of a towing company he'd never heard of. Her cell number was printed in neat block letters beneath her name, and someone, probably Tansy herself, had added a handwritten note in the margin. Serious calls only. I mean it." Amos stared at the card for another 5 minutes before dialing. The phone rang 4 times, and he was about to hang up when Tansy's voice came through, slightly breathless as if she'd been running. "McCoy Towing, this is Tansy." "It's Amos Rutledge," he said, then hesitated, suddenly unsure what he'd planned to say. "From the truck stop, 3 nights ago. You said I could call if I needed to talk." There was a brief pause, and he heard what sounded like a car door slamming in the background. "Give me 2 minutes," she said. "I'm finishing up a tow. Don't hang up." He waited, listening to muffled sounds of work. Chains rattling, hydraulics hissing, a brief exchange with someone whose words he couldn't make out. Then Tansy came back on the line, and this time she sounded more focused, more present. "Okay, I'm here. What's going on?" "I can't stop thinking about it," Amos admitted, feeling foolish even as the words left his mouth. "The lights, the flood, everything Lyle told me about the missing driver. It's like it's stuck in my head and I can't shake it loose. I keep wondering if I should have done something different. If there was a way to help that other driver. If—" "Stop," Tansy interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "You can't think like that. You did exactly what you needed to do, which was survive. That's the only responsibility you had out there, and you fulfilled it. What happened to the other driver isn't on you." "But what if I saw him?" Amos pressed. "What if those headlights behind me were his truck and he was trying to follow me to safety, and I didn't realize it?" "The timeline doesn't work," Tansy said. "I told you that truck had been sitting in the water for hours before you came through. The driver was already gone by the time you entered the flood zone. Whatever you saw behind you, it wasn't him." "Then what was it?" Amos asked, hearing the desperation creeping back into his voice. "What follows someone through a flood and then vanishes? What kind of vehicle does that?" Tansy was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted into something more careful, more measured. "Can you meet me somewhere? This isn't really a conversation for the phone, and I have some things I want to show you. Things that might help you understand what's happening on that stretch of road." An hour later, Amos found himself sitting across from Tansy in a small diner on the outskirts of a town whose name he'd already forgotten. She'd brought a weathered accordion folder stuffed with papers, photographs, and what looked like official incident reports. She ordered coffee for both of them, waited until the waitress was out of earshot, then spread the contents of the folder across the table between them. "This is everything I've collected over the past 5 years," she said, organizing the papers into rough categories. "Tow reports, highway patrol incident summaries, statements from drivers who experienced something unusual between mile markers 210 and 220. Most of this is officially classified as weather-related incidents or driver error, but when you look at the patterns, you start to see something else." Amos picked up the nearest photograph. It showed a sedan half submerged in water, its hood crumpled against a concrete barrier. The image was dated from 2 years ago. "What am I looking at?" "Single vehicle accident at mile marker 216, Tansy explained. Driver claimed she was following taillights through heavy rain, thought it was a truck or another car leading the way through a flooded section. When the lights stopped suddenly, she braked hard and lost control. Ended up in the median with her car totaled and a concussion. But here's the thing. Highway patrol couldn't find any other vehicle in the area. No tire tracks, no debris, nothing to indicate anyone else had been on that road. Maybe whoever she was following kept going," Amos suggested. "Didn't realize she'd crashed." Tansy shook her head. "She had a dash cam. I've seen the footage. It shows her following a pair of red taillights for almost 3 miles, maintaining a steady distance, and then the lights just blink out. Not like they drove away or turned off the road. They literally disappear mid-frame. 1 second they're there, the next second they're gone, and she's slamming on her brakes with nothing in front of her. She pulled out another report, this one more recent. Last October, a trucker called in a stranded motorist at mile marker 214. Said there was a woman standing on the shoulder in the rain, waving for help. He pulled over, got out to check on her, and she was gone. No car, no footprints in the mud, nothing. He searched the area for 20 minutes, thinking maybe she'd fallen down an embankment or wandered into the trees, but found no trace of her. Highway Patrol responded, searched until dawn, same result. No one there. Amos felt cold settling in his chest. What are you saying? That the road is haunted? That ghosts are flagging down truckers and leading people into accidents? I'm saying the road does things, Tansy said carefully. Things that don't make sense if you're trying to explain them with normal physics or normal logic. I've been pulling vehicles out of that stretch for years, and I've heard enough stories from enough reliable drivers to know that something is happening there. Something that uses light and sound and familiar shapes to interact with people, though I couldn't begin to tell you why or what it wants. She pulled out one more photograph and Amos recognized it immediately. It was the image Lyle had shown him. The amber hazard lights floating in darkness, disconnected from any visible source. But this version was clearer, higher resolution, and he could see details he'd missed before. The lights weren't quite symmetrical, and they seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was almost organic, like breathing or a heartbeat. The missing driver took this, Tansy said. But he's not the first person to photograph those lights. I've collected 7 similar images over the past 3 years, all from different drivers, all taken in roughly the same location. The lights always look the same. Same color, same spacing, same pulsing pattern. Like they're always there, waiting, and they only become visible under certain conditions. What conditions? Amos asked. That's what I've been trying to figure out, Tansy admitted. At first I thought it was just weather-related, heavy rain, fog, reduced visibility. But then I started tracking the dates and I found something interesting. The incidents cluster around certain times of the year, late September, early December, mid-March. 3 windows when the reports spike dramatically. Amos thought about this, trying to find meaning in the pattern. What's significant about those dates? I don't know yet, Tansy said. But I've been working with someone who might have an answer. He's a surveyor, works for the county, and he's been researching the history of that section of highway. Turns out the road was built over what used to be wetlands, marshes and seasonal floodplains that were drained and filled in the 1960s when they first laid the asphalt. And before that, going back 100 years or more, the area was known for being treacherous. Travelers getting lost, wagons disappearing, people reporting lights in the marsh that led them astray. Marsh lights, Amos said, dredging up a memory from high school science class. Will-o'-the-wisps, caused by decomposing organic matter releasing gases that ignite when they hit air. It's a natural phenomenon. Right, Tansy agreed. Except marsh lights are green or blue, not amber, and they flicker randomly, not in a steady pulse. And they definitely don't follow vehicles or guide them through flood zones. Whatever these lights are, they're not just swamp gas. Amos spread the photographs out, studying them in sequence. 7 different images, 7 different drivers, but the lights in each picture looked essentially identical. Same color, same formation, same impossible detachment from any physical source. Have you shown this to Lyle? To Highway Patrol? Lyle's seen some of it, Tansy said. He's sympathetic, but there's only so much he can do officially. You can't close a major highway because of unexplained lights and missing drivers. Not without concrete evidence of a hazard. And these incidents are just scattered enough, just ambiguous enough, that they don't meet the threshold for official action. So the road stays open, the reports keep coming in, And every few months, someone has an experience they can't explain. She gathered the papers back into the folder, but left the photographs on the table between them. The reason I wanted to talk to you in person is because your experience was different. Most drivers see the lights and avoid them, or they follow them and end up in trouble. But you followed them and made it through safely. That's unusual. That suggests the lights were actively helping you rather than trying to mislead you. Why would they do that? Amos asked. What makes me different from the driver who disappeared? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Tansy said. I've been going through the reports, looking for patterns in who gets helped and who gets hurt. So far, I haven't found anything conclusive, but there are hints. Drivers who stay calm seem to fare better than drivers who panic. People who trust their instincts, who pay attention to what the lights are actually showing them rather than just blindly following, they tend to come through okay. But drivers who freeze up, who ignore warning signs, who push forward when they should stop, those are the ones who end up stranded or worse. Amos thought about his journey through the flood zone, about the decisions he'd made in those crucial moments. He'd been afraid, certainly, but he'd also been focused, analytical, treating the situation like a problem to be solved rather than a supernatural encounter to be feared. Maybe that had made the difference. Maybe the lights responded to intention, to the mental state of the driver, showing help to those who could use it and becoming something else for those who couldn't. Or maybe he was just rationalizing, trying to impose order on chaos, looking for meaning in a series of random events that happened to align in his favor. There was no way to know, no experiment he could run to test the hypothesis. All he had were stories and photographs and the persistent feeling that he'd been touched by something vast and strange and utterly indifferent to human understanding. What happened to the missing driver? Amos asked quietly. Is the search still active? Tansy's expression darkened. They called it off yesterday. After 72 hours with no leads, no body, no evidence of where he went, they had to allocate resources elsewhere. Officially, he's listed as a missing person, presumed drowned in the flood. His family is planning a memorial service next week. But you don't think he drowned? I don't know what to think, Tansy admitted. His truck was found with the engine off and the keys still in the ignition. The doors were unlocked, which suggests he got out voluntarily rather than being trapped by rising water. But there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle, no indication of which direction he went. It's like he stepped out of the cab and vanished into thin air. Or into water, Amos thought. Into the flood zone where the lights pulsed and ordinary rules stopped applying. Maybe the driver had followed those amber beacons out of his truck, thinking they were leading him to safety, and instead they'd led him somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that looked like the highway but wasn't, that felt like the real world but operated according to different principles. There's one more thing, Tansy said, lowering her voice even though the diner was nearly empty. The surveyor I mentioned, the one researching the history of the road, he found something in the county archives. Back in 1962, when they were draining the wetlands to prepare for highway construction, 3 workers disappeared over the course of 6 weeks. Different incidents, different circumstances, but all 3 vanished without a trace. The construction company covered it up, listed them as having quit or moved away. But there were rumors. People said the marsh didn't want to be drained, that it fought back, that it took those workers as payment or revenge or warning. That's just superstition, Amos said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe, Tansy agreed. Or maybe when you pave over something old and wild and deeply rooted in the landscape, you don't actually destroy it. You just force it to adapt, to find new ways of expressing itself. The wetlands are gone, but maybe something of what they were remains, trapped under the asphalt, reaching up through cracks and flood zones, using the tools available to it, headlights and hazard signals and CB radio frequencies, to communicate in a language we're only beginning to recognize. It was the most thoroughly unsettling thing anyone had said to him about the incident, precisely because it almost made sense. Not scientific sense, but a kind of internal logic that acknowledged something everyone who spent enough time on the road eventually understood. That highways weren't just engineering projects, that they were living systems with their own rhythms and personalities and occasional fits of inexplicable behavior. Amos had driven through stretches where accidents clustered for no apparent reason, where every trucker knew to be extra careful even if they couldn't articulate why. He'd felt the difference between roads that welcomed travelers and roads that merely tolerated them. He'd experienced that odd sensation of being watched from empty fields, of sensing presence in places that should have been completely lifeless. He'd always dismissed these feelings as imagination or fatigue. But maybe they were something more. Maybe roads absorbed the energy of the places they crossed, the history of the land they covered, and occasionally that absorption became something active, something that reached back. "What do I do with this information?" Amos asked finally. "How do I live with knowing what I know?" Tansy closed the folder and met his eyes with a steady gaze. "You do what every driver does who's seen something they can't explain. You file it away, you stay alert, and you trust your instincts when something feels wrong. You don't take unnecessary risks, but you don't let fear paralyze you either. And if you ever find yourself back on that stretch of road during a storm, you remember what happened last time. You remember what the lights showed you, and you make the best decisions you can with the information available. And if I see those lights again, then you pay attention," Tansy said. "Because they might be trying to help you, or they might be trying to lead you astray, and the only way to tell the difference is to stay calm and watch carefully and trust the part of yourself that knows when something is guidance and when something is lure." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unsolved mysteries pressing down on the small booth. Finally, Amos gathered his courage and asked the question that had been nagging at him since Lyle had first shown him that photograph. "Do you think the missing driver is still alive? Somewhere?" Tansy considered this carefully before answering. "I think he's somewhere," she said slowly. "Whether that somewhere is a place we would recognize as being part of the living world, I genuinely don't know. But I hope, for his family's sake, that wherever he is, he found what he was looking for when he followed those lights out into the water." Amos left the diner with more questions than answers, but somehow the conversation had helped. Knowing that someone else was tracking these incidents, trying to make sense of the pattern, made him feel less isolated, less like he was losing his grip on reality. Tansy had given him permission to trust his experience without demanding that he explain or justify it, and that was a gift whose value he was only beginning to appreciate. He drove back to Oakdale through clear weather and familiar roads, but something had shifted in his relationship with the highway. He paid more attention now to the small anomalies, the moments when light behaved strangely or sounds carried further than they should. He started keeping a notebook in his cab, jotting down observations that might have seemed trivial before. Unusual CB transmissions, lights in unexpected places, stretches of road that felt different somehow. Most of it was probably meaningless, just the normal chaos of weather and traffic and human activity. But every so often he caught something that made him pause, made him wonder if the road was speaking a language he was only beginning to learn how to hear. And he thought about the missing driver, about whether that man had heard the same language and simply misunderstood what it was trying to say. 3 weeks after his encounter at mile marker 214, Amos received a call from Lyle Pennington. Highway Patrol had recovered a body from the river 5 miles downstream from the flood zone. male, approximately the right age, wearing clothing that matched the description of what the missing driver had been wearing. Positive identification would take time, but it seemed likely they'd found him. "Thought you'd want to know," Lyle said, his voice carrying the professional detachment of someone who delivered this kind of news too often. "Looks like he tried to walk out of the flood zone, got swept downstream by the current. It happens more often than people realize. Water's powerful, especially at night when you can't see how fast it's moving." "Yeah," Amos said, because what else was there to say? "Thanks for letting me know." But after he hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that the official explanation, while convenient and rational, didn't quite fit what he knew about that night. The missing driver's truck had been found with the engine off and the doors unlocked, positioned as if he'd parked deliberately rather than been forced off the road. That suggested he'd stopped because the lights told him to stop, that he'd gotten out because the lights had shown him something worth investigating, and maybe he had walked into the water, following those amber beacons, thinking they were leading him to safety or help or answers. But Amos didn't believe the current had swept him away. He believed the driver had followed the lights somewhere else, somewhere that intersected with the ordinary world but wasn't quite part of it, and that his body washing up 5 miles downstream was just the road's way of closing the loop, of returning what it had taken. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it left him with a strange sense of calm, an acceptance that the world contained mysteries that wouldn't be solved by investigation or explanation. The road had shown him something impossible, had guided him through danger using tools that shouldn't exist, and he'd survived because he'd paid attention and stayed focused and treated the experience as real, rather than dismissing it as hallucination. That was enough. That would have to be enough. Because dwelling on what might have happened, on alternate timelines where he'd made different choices and ended up like the missing driver, would drive him slowly mad. Better to accept the gift of survival and move forward, carrying the knowledge of what he'd seen like a secret compass that would help him navigate future encounters with the strange and the unexplained. And if he ever found himself at mile marker 214 during a storm, with amber lights pulsing in the darkness and water rising across the road, he would remember this moment and make his choices carefully. Because the road had already shown him mercy once, and he couldn't count on it being merciful twice. 6 months passed before Amos found himself facing the decision he'd been dreading since that night in the storm. His dispatcher called on a Tuesday afternoon with a rush delivery, refrigerated pharmaceuticals that needed to reach a hospital in the Northern Valley by morning. The route was simple, direct, and unavoidable. Highway 38, straight through the section that included mile marker 214. "Can you take it?" the dispatcher asked, oblivious to the tension that had crept into Amos's silence. "I know it's short notice, but the regular driver called in sick, and you're the only one in position to make the timeline work." Amos sat in his truck at a rest area 40 miles south of Junction City, watching clouds build on the western horizon. The weather forecast predicted rain, heavy at times, with flash flood warnings for the valley. Everything about the setup felt like a repetition, like the universe was offering him a chance to face the same test again, to see if he'd learned anything from his previous encounter, or if he'd make different choices this time. "Yeah," he heard himself say, "I'll take it." He spent the next hour preparing in ways that had nothing to do with checking his load or verifying his route. He tested his CB radio repeatedly, making sure it was functioning properly and tuned to the right frequencies. He charged his cell phone to full capacity and downloaded offline maps of the entire region in case his GPS failed again. He checked his emergency supplies, flashlight with fresh batteries, reflective triangles, first aid kit, enough water and non-perishable food to last several days if he got stranded. Most importantly, he called Tansy McCoy and told her his route. She didn't try to talk him out of it, didn't offer warnings or advice. She just listened, then said, "I'll keep my radio on tonight. Channel 19, if you need anything at all, you call out and I'll hear you. I'll be working in the area anyway, so response time would be under 20 minutes. "You're working the same stretch?" Amos asked, hearing the concern in his own voice. "Someone has to," Tansy said simply. "And I'd rather it be someone who knows what they're looking for." He merged onto Highway 38 just as the sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of copper and rust that reminded him uncomfortably of those amber hazard lights. The rain started almost immediately, a light drizzle that gradually intensified as he drove north, as the miles brought him closer to the section he'd been avoiding for half a year. Other trucks shared the highway with him, their running lights creating brief moments of companionship before they exited or fell behind, leaving him alone with the rain and the growing darkness. Mile marker 200 passed, then 205, then 210. Each number felt significant, a countdown to something he couldn't quite name. The barricades Lyle had mentioned were visible this time, bright orange barriers positioned on the shoulder with flashers that pulsed in regular intervals. But the road itself remained open, the water across the pavement no deeper than usual for this kind of rain, and Amos continued forward because his load needed to reach its destination, and because turning back now would feel like cowardice. Mile marker 214 appeared in his headlights at exactly 11:34 p.m., and Amos felt his breath catch despite his determination to stay calm. The road looked ordinary. Wet pavement, white lane markers, reflective signs indicating curves ahead. No amber lights, no phantom vehicles, no distorted voices on the CB, just a normal stretch of highway in the rain, indistinguishable from thousands of other miles he'd driven over the years. He should have felt relieved. Instead, the normalcy felt wrong somehow, like a held breath, like the moment before a storm breaks when the air goes still and heavy with anticipation. He drove past the marker, watching his odometer tick forward, waiting for something to happen. But the road continued unchanged, and after another mile, he started to wonder if he'd built the whole experience up in his mind, if 6 months of dwelling on it had transformed a harrowing but ultimately explainable encounter into something supernatural and significant. Then his CB radio crackled to life. Not with the distorted voice from before, but with something different. A woman's voice, clear and calm, with an accent he couldn't quite place. "Northbound traffic approaching mile marker 216, be advised. Vehicle stopped on the shoulder with hazards on. Driver appears to need assistance." Amos grabbed his handset immediately. "This is northbound at 216. I don't see any vehicle. Can you confirm the location?" Static answered him. Then the same voice repeated the message word for word, in exactly the same tone, like a recording. "Northbound traffic approaching mile marker 216, be advised. Vehicle stopped on the shoulder with hazards on. Driver appears to need assistance." His headlights caught something ahead, a dark shape on the right shoulder, barely visible through the rain. As he got closer, the shape resolved into a pickup truck, older model, sitting at an angle with its hazard lights flashing. A figure stood beside it, illuminated intermittently by the amber pulses, waving one arm in what looked like a signal for help. Every instinct Amos had developed over 11 years of driving screamed at him to keep going. The setup was too familiar, too similar to the scenarios Tansy had described from her reports. But pharmaceutical deliveries meant nothing if he drove past someone who genuinely needed help, if he let fear of the inexplicable turn him into someone who ignored basic human decency. He slowed, pulling onto the shoulder about 30 feet behind the pickup, and set his air brakes. The rain hammered against his windshield as he studied the scene, looking for details that would tell him whether this was real or another manifestation of whatever haunted this stretch of road. The pickup looked solid enough. Mud on the tires, a dent in the rear quarter panel, a faded bumper sticker that he couldn't quite read. The figure beside it was wearing a rain jacket, hood pulled up against the weather, and continued waving, more urgently now. Amos picked up his CB handset and tried a different approach. "Tansy, you monitoring?" Her response came back immediately, clear and welcome. "I copy, Amos. What's your 20? "Mile marker 216, northbound shoulder. Got a pickup with hazards and someone flagging for help. Does this match any active service calls?" A pause, during which Amos watched the figure approach his truck, moving through the rain with purpose. "Negative," Tansy said finally. "No calls for that location. No other reports of disabled vehicles. You want me to head your way?" "Stand by," Amos said, setting down the handset and rolling down his window as the figure reached his door. The rain immediately soaked his left sleeve, cold water running down his arm. But he needed to hear the person's voice, needed to assess whether they were real or something else. The figure pulled back their hood, and Amos found himself looking at a woman in her 50s, with gray hair plastered to her skull by the rain, and an expression that mixed relief with exhaustion. "Thank God," she said, her voice rough with strain. "I've been here for over an hour. Cell phone's dead, no one else has stopped, and I can't get the tire changed by myself. The lug nuts are rusted on too tight." It sounded real. She sounded real. The kind of specific detail that hallucinations rarely included. The frustration and fatigue that came from genuine distress rather than supernatural manipulation. But Amos had learned to question his assumptions, to look for inconsistencies before committing to action. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked surprised by the question, then suspicious. "Why do you need my name? Are you going to help me or not?" "Just trying to confirm you're who you say you are," Amos said, keeping his tone apologetic but firm. "There have been incidents on this stretch of road. People seeing things that aren't there. I need to make sure you're real before I get out of my truck." The woman's expression shifted from suspicion to something like understanding, and maybe a touch of fear. "You've seen them too," she said quietly. "The lights that move, the voices on the radio that repeat. I thought I was losing my mind." That answer felt more right than anything else could have. Someone who was genuinely stranded, who'd been sitting alone in the rain on this particular section of highway, would have noticed the strangeness, would have started to question what was real and what wasn't. "My name is Amos Rutledge," he said, making a decision. "I'm going to help you, but we're going to do this carefully, and if anything feels wrong, we're both getting back in our vehicles immediately. Understood?" She nodded quickly. "Understood. I'm just grateful someone finally stopped. My name's—" She paused, seemed to struggle with something, then continued in a voice that had gone oddly flat. "My name's Marigold Keene." The moment she said it, Amos felt something shift. The name was wrong somehow, not in an obvious way, but in a subtle dissonance that his instincts picked up before his conscious mind could process why. He glanced past her at the pickup truck, and details that had seemed normal moments ago now stood out as inconsistent. The mud on the tires was dry despite the rain. The dent in the quarter panel looked too perfect, too symmetrical, as if someone had created the platonic ideal of a dent rather than actual damage from a collision. And the bumper sticker, now that he looked at it directly, showed text that seemed to shift and blur, never quite coming into focus. "Actually," Amos said carefully, "I just remembered I need to check something with my dispatcher before I can stop to help. Give me just a moment." He rolled up his window before she could respond and grabbed his CB handset with shaking hands. "Tansy, something's wrong. The woman gave me a name, but it felt off, and the vehicle doesn't look right when you pay attention to the details. I think this is it. I think this is what we've been talking about." "Get out of there," Tansy said immediately, her voice sharp with urgency. "Don't engage. Don't try to help. Just release your brakes and go. I'm heading your way now, but you need to move immediately." Amos looked in his side mirror and felt his stomach drop. The woman was still standing beside his truck, but she wasn't moving. She stood perfectly still, one arm raised in that waving gesture frozen like a paused video. The rain fell around her but didn't seem to touch her, droplets passing through her form rather than striking it. And behind her, the pickup truck was fading, becoming translucent, its edges blurring into the darkness as if it had never been fully solid to begin with. He released his air brakes and put the truck in gear, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. As he pulled away from the shoulder, he glanced in his mirror one last time and saw the woman, or the thing that looked like a woman, still standing in the same position, arm raised, face turned toward his retreating truck, and then she blinked out of existence as completely as if someone had flipped a switch, leaving only empty road and falling rain. "I'm clear," Amos said into the CB, hearing the tremor in his own voice. "It's gone. The whole thing just vanished." "Keep driving," Tansy instructed. "Don't stop until you're past mile marker 220. I'll meet you at the truck stop at 237, same as last time." The next 4 miles were the longest of Amos's life. He watched his mirrors obsessively, searching for any sign that the apparition was following him, or that other manifestations might appear. But the road remained empty, except for his truck and the rain, and gradually his pulse began to slow, his breathing to return to normal. He'd passed the test, had recognized the trap before stepping into it, had trusted his instincts over his desire to help. That should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like he'd barely escaped something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. Tansy was waiting for him at the truck stop, her wrecker parked in the same spot it had occupied 6 months ago. They sat in his cab this time, the heater running to ward off the chill of the rain, and he told her everything that had happened. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled as he described the woman who'd given a name that felt wrong, the pickup truck that faded like mist, the way reality had seemed to unravel once he started questioning what he was seeing. "Marigold Keene," Tansy said slowly when he finished. "That's interesting." "Why?" "Because that's one of the names I've seen in the old records," she said. "From the highway construction project in 1962. Marigold Keene was a surveyor who worked on draining the wetlands. She was one of the 3 people who disappeared during the construction, though officially she was listed as having moved out of state for family reasons." Amos felt cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "So, that thing on the road was using her name. Why?" "Maybe because it's the only name it knows," Tansy suggested. "Or maybe because it's trying to communicate something about its own origins, showing you a piece of the history that created it. The road was built over the wetlands, and the wetlands took those 3 workers, and now something that uses the road's infrastructure, lights, CB signals, the shapes of vehicles, is reaching out in the only way it can." "Reaching out for what?" Amos asked. "What does it want?" Tansy was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the rain. "I don't think it wants anything," she said finally. "I think it is, like a recording that keeps playing, or an echo that never quite fades. The wetlands were drained, but never truly destroyed, and the people who disappeared into them left something of themselves behind. Now that residue manifests through the infrastructure we built on top of it, using our tools and our symbols, because those are the only things available in a landscape that's been completely transformed. It was a theory, nothing more, but it felt more true than any supernatural explanation could have. The idea that the road itself had become a medium for something older, That human engineering had inadvertently created a channel for the memory of the landscape to express itself made a kind of terrible sense, and it meant there was no fixing it, no exorcism or cleansing that would make the road safe. The manifestations would continue as long as the conditions were right. Heavy rain, reduced visibility, the particular alignment of weather and time that opened whatever doorway existed between the world as it was and the world as it had been. "What do I do?" Amos asked quietly. "How do I keep driving this route knowing what I know?" "You stay alert," Tansy said. "You trust your instincts, and you remember that the manifestations can be recognized if you look carefully enough. They always have details that don't quite add up. Names that feel wrong, vehicles that don't behave correctly, situations that seem just slightly off. Your brain knows the difference between real and not real, even if it can't always articulate why. Listen to that knowledge. Don't override it because you want to be helpful or because you're afraid of seeming paranoid." She pulled something from her pocket and handed it to him, a small compass, the kind hikers carried, with a brass case worn smooth by years of handling. This belonged to one of the surveyors from the original construction project. Not Keene, but another one who disappeared. I bought it at an estate sale years ago, before I knew its history. Keep it with you when you drive this stretch. I don't know if it actually does anything, but sometimes having a physical object that predates the road, that remembers what the landscape used to be, seems to help. Drivers who carry talismans from the area's past report fewer encounters. Amos took the compass and opened it. The needle swung wildly for a moment, then settled, pointing northwest, which was completely wrong for their current position. "It doesn't work," he said. "It works fine," Tansy corrected. "It's just not pointing to magnetic north. It's pointing to something else, where the wetlands used to be, maybe, or where the original marsh was deepest. I don't pretend to understand it, but I know that needle has never pointed true north since I got it. Doesn't matter where you are or which direction you're facing. It always points the same direction." Amos closed the compass and slipped it into his pocket, feeling the weight of it against his leg. It was absurd, carrying a broken compass as protection against supernatural manifestations on a highway. But absurdity seemed to be the operating principle of this entire situation, and he'd take whatever small comfort he could find. He completed his delivery without further incident, made his return trip via the alternate route, and filed his report with his dispatcher using carefully neutral language that mentioned weather delays but nothing else. The pharmaceutical company was satisfied. His driving record remained clean, and life returned to something approximating normal, but he knew he'd crossed a threshold that night. Had been tested twice by whatever haunted mile marker 214 and had passed both times through a combination of caution, instinct, and sheer luck. 3 months later, he was driving a different route entirely when his CB crackled and a familiar voice came through, distorted, slowed down, but unmistakably the same voice from that first night. "Standing water at mile marker 214. Use caution." Amos checked his GPS. He was nowhere near Highway 38. Was, in fact, more than 200 miles away on a completely different road. But the warning continued, repeating at regular intervals, and he understood that distance didn't matter to whatever was sending the message. It had marked him somehow, had recognized him as someone who could perceive its manifestations, and now it was reaching out across space to communicate something he couldn't quite interpret. He pulled the compass from his pocket and opened it. The needle, which should have been pointing randomly or to magnetic north, was pointing directly backward, toward the route he'd already traveled. Toward Highway 38 and mile marker 214, 200 miles behind him but somehow still present, still exerting influence. "I hear you," Amos said quietly. though he didn't key the CB microphone, didn't transmit the words anywhere but into the empty cab of his truck. "I hear you, and I understand that you're there. But I can't come back, not today, not by choice." The voice on the CB continued its warning for another minute, then fell silent. The compass needle swung back to its default position, northwest, toward the place where wetlands used to be. And Amos drove on through clear weather and ordinary roads, carrying the knowledge that he'd been changed by his encounters, marked by something that existed in the margins between what was and what used to be. He still drives the same routes, still makes his deliveries on schedule, still maintains his perfect safety record. But he carries the compass with him always, and he listens to the CB even when nothing seems to be transmitting. And he watches for lights that pulse in rhythms that don't quite match normal vehicle flashers, because he knows now that the road remembers, that landscape holds memory in ways that engineering can't erase, and that sometimes the past reaches up through the present in forms we barely recognize until we're already following them into the dark. And on nights when the rain comes down hard and the Weather Service issues flood warnings for the valley, he takes the alternate route without being asked, makes the choice that adds hours to his journey, but keeps him away from mile marker 2 and 14. Not because he's afraid, exactly, but because he's learned that some invitations shouldn't be accepted, some lights shouldn't be followed, and some questions are better left unanswered by those who still have the luxury of choice. The road is patient. The road is always there. And someday, when conditions align and circumstances force him back to that stretch of highway in the middle of a storm, he'll have to face it again. But until that day comes, he drives carefully, pays attention to details, and trusts the part of himself that knows when something is reaching out from beneath the asphalt, using the language of lights and voices and familiar shapes to say things that can't be translated into human words. The amber lights still pulse at mile marker 214 on rainy nights. Other drivers still report seeing them, still follow them into flood zones or pull over to investigate. Some make it through. Some don't. And the road continues to take what it takes and return what it returns, following logic that predates highways and human engineering, expressing something that was here before the pavement and will remain long after the asphalt cracks and crumbles and the wetlands begin their slow reclamation of the land that was taken from them. Amos Rutledge knows this. He carries it with him on every drive, this knowledge of what waits in the places where past and present intersect, where memory becomes manifest, where the road speaks in a language only some can hear. And he drives on because that's what truckers do. They drive on through darkness and uncertainty, carrying their loads and their secrets, marked by experiences that can't be explained but can never be forgotten. The compass rests in his pocket, pointing always toward the wetlands that used to be. And sometimes, late at night when the rain is heavy and the road stretches empty before him, Amos pulls it out and watches the needle swing, and wonders what it would be like to follow that direction, to drive off the pavement and into the landscape that remembers, to finally understand what the lights have been trying to show him all along. But he doesn't follow. Not yet. Because he's a professional driver with deliveries to make and a life that still makes sense in the ordinary world. And because some mysteries once solved can't be unsolved, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The road waits. The lights pulse, and mile marker 214 stands at the edge of the flood zone, marking the place where reality bends and the past bleeds through, and drivers who pay attention learn that the world is stranger and deeper and more dangerous than any map could ever show. Amos Rutledge drives carefully. He stays alert, and he remembers. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Ephraim Kincaid picked up the load in Charlotte, and the Weather Service was calling it a 100-year storm, the kind of sustained downpour that turned creeks into rivers and turned rivers into something that didn't have a name yet. Ifif had been driving trucks for 16 years, hauling everything from furniture to frozen food across the eastern seaboard, and he'd learned to respect water in all its forms. Flash floods could turn a routine drive into a life-threatening situation faster than any other road hazard, and standing water hid dangers that weren't visible until your wheels were already sinking into them. But the load needed to move. Medical equipment bound for a hospital in Richmond, and F had never missed a delivery in his career. The dispatcher had given him the option to wait out the storm, but that would mean delays that could cost the company money and potentially put patients at risk if the equipment was urgently needed. So he'd done his pre-trip inspection in the driving rain, secured his load with extra care, and pulled out of the distribution center just after dawn on a Thursday morning that looked more like dusk. The interstate was manageable at first, traffic moving slowly but steadily through the downpour. Other trucks shared the road with him, their running lights creating brief moments of solidarity before they took different exits or pulled into rest areas to wait for conditions to improve. EFH kept his speed conservative, maintained proper following distance, and listened to the weather updates on the AM band, tracking the storm's progression and the flood warnings that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. He was somewhere in the middle of Virginia, maybe 40 miles south of Richmond, when he saw the detour signs. Orange barricades blocked the northbound lanes, and digital message boards flashed warnings about flooding ahead and mandatory exit at the next ramp. A highway crew in rain gear waved traffic toward the off-ramp, directing vehicles onto a state route that would bypass the flooded section and rejoin the interstate further north. EFH followed the line of cars and trucks taking the detour, watching his GPS recalculate the route to account for the change. The state road was 2 lanes, well-maintained but narrow, cutting through farmland and patches of forest that looked waterlogged and miserable in the gray morning light. The rain continued its relentless assault, and his wipers struggled to keep up even on the highest setting, creating brief windows of clarity followed by sheets of water that turned the windshield into an impressionist painting. The detour route climbed gradually into higher terrain, away from the valley where the flooding was worst, and for a while the driving became slightly easier. The road surface was wet but not submerged, and the traffic spread out as faster vehicles passed the slower trucks and RVs that labored up the inclines. EFH maintained his position in the right lane, content to take his time, to arrive safely rather than quickly. He was checking his mirrors and preparing to navigate a gentle curve when he saw it. A yellow shape in the median, just barely visible through the rain. His first thought was construction equipment, maybe a backhoe or grader left by the road crew. But as his headlights swept across it, the shape resolved into something instantly recognizable and completely wrong for this location. A school bus, full-sized, sitting at an angle in the grass median between the northbound and southbound lanes, its front end pointing south as if it had been traveling in the opposite direction before somehow ending up off the road. The yellow paint was faded and streaked with rust, and several windows appeared to be broken or missing entirely. It looked abandoned, like it had been sitting there for months or years, rather than being recently involved in an accident. EFH felt his stomach tighten. A school bus in the median should have been surrounded by emergency vehicles, police cars, fire trucks, ambulances. There should have been flares, warning signs, responders working to secure the scene and help any passengers. But there was nothing. Just the bus sitting alone in the rain, dark and silent, with no indication that anyone knew it was there or cared that it existed. He slowed immediately, his training and his instincts both screaming that something was seriously wrong. His CB radio had been quiet for the past 20 minutes, but he grabbed the handset now and keyed the transmit button. "This is eastbound on State Route 42, approximately mile marker 18. Got a school bus in the median, appears to be abandoned. Anyone know anything about this? Static answered him, thick and crackling with the kind of interference heavy rain produced. He tried again, rephrasing the question, but got the same response. Just noise, no voices, no acknowledgement that anyone had heard him. He switched channels, tried the emergency frequency, even attempted to raise the highway crew that had directed him onto the detour, but the radio gave him nothing but variations of static. The bus was maybe 100 yards ahead now, and F could see more details as he approached. The emergency exit at the rear was hanging open, swinging slightly in the wind. Mud covered the lower panels, splattered up from the wheels as if the bus had been driven through deep water or soft ground. And there, on the side panel just below the windows, he could make out a number. 1247. The paint was old and fading, but the digits were still legible. A car passed him going the opposite direction, its headlights briefly illuminating the bus from the other side, and Eve caught a glimpse of movement inside, or thought he did. It was hard to be sure through the rain and the dirty windows, but something had shifted in there, a shadow moving from one seat to another. He couldn't just drive past. If there were people inside that bus, especially children, they needed help. The fact that there were no emergency vehicles on scene suggested that maybe the accident had just happened, that he was the first person to come across it. Or maybe, and this thought made his chest tight, maybe the bus had been here longer and everyone else had simply driven past without stopping, assuming someone else had already called it in. F activated his hazard lights and carefully pulled onto the shoulder, positioning his truck so it would be visible to traffic coming from both directions. He set his air brakes, grabbed his rain jacket and flashlight, and climbed down from the cab into the downpour. The rain was cold and driving, hitting him hard enough that it stung exposed skin, and the ground beneath his boots was soft, water pooling in every depression. He approached the bus cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the rain and playing across the yellow panels. Up close, the deterioration was even more apparent. The paint wasn't just faded, it was peeling in long strips, exposing rust underneath. The tires looked dry-rotted, cracked, and sagging as if they'd lost most of their air pressure. The whole vehicle had the appearance of something that had been sitting derelict for a very long time, not something that had recently been in service. But that didn't make sense. If this was an abandoned bus that had been here for months or years, why hadn't it been towed? Why wasn't it on the incident reports that Highway Patrol would have filed? Why did it look like it had just been driven through mud and water, with fresh splatter patterns that couldn't be more than hours old? FH reached the front of the bus and shined his light through the windshield. The driver's seat was empty, the steering wheel covered in a layer of grime. Rain poured through gaps where the windshield seals had deteriorated, creating small waterfalls that splashed onto the dashboard. The interior looked abandoned. Seats covered in debris and what might have been animal droppings, the floor littered with trash that had accumulated over time. But there, about halfway back, was fresh mud. A trail of it leading from the emergency exit at the rear toward the front, as if someone had walked through the bus recently, their shoes leaving wet prints that hadn't had time to dry. And now that he was closer, Eve could hear something, a sound that made his skin crawl despite his determination to stay rational. Children's laughter, faint and distant, like it was coming from very far away or from behind thick walls, but unmistakable in its quality. The high-pitched, unself-conscious sound of kids finding something genuinely funny. It rose and fell in waves, punctuated by what sounded like whispered conversation, though he couldn't make out any actual words. Eve's hand tightened on his flashlight. The logical part of his brain insisted this was just audio distortion caused by the rain. Wind whistling through broken windows, creating sounds that his pattern-seeking mind interpreted as human voices. but the part of him that had survived 16 years on the road by trusting his instincts was screaming that something was deeply wrong here, that he should get back in his truck immediately and call for official help rather than investigating alone. He compromised by moving to the side of the bus and shining his light through one of the intact windows. The beam illuminated rows of seats, all facing forward in the standard configuration. Most were empty, but 3 seats near the middle showed signs of recent occupancy. The vinyl surfaces looked clean, free of the dust and debris that covered the others. And on one of those seats, barely visible in the beam of his flashlight, was a small backpack, bright blue, with cartoon characters on it, looking new and out of place in the deteriorated interior. The laughter came again, louder this time, and definitely coming from inside the bus. Eve moved toward the open emergency exit at the rear, his boots squelching in the wet grass. The door hung at an angle, one hinge broken, and mud was smeared across the steps as if multiple people had used them recently. He climbed up carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it, and pulled himself into the interior of the bus. The smell hit him immediately, mold and rot and stagnant water, the odor of abandonment and decay. But underneath that was something else, something fresher. The scent of rain-wet clothing and the faint chemical smell of laundry detergent. Someone had been here recently. Someone who washed their clothes in modern detergent and wore shoes that tracked mud in patterns consistent with active use rather than years of weathering. "Hello," Ive called out, his voice sounding small and swallowed by the rain hammering on the metal roof. "Anyone here? Do you need help?" No answer. The laughter had stopped the moment he climbed aboard, cutting off so abruptly that the silence felt deliberate, as if whoever had been making the sound was now holding their breath and waiting. Eve moved slowly down the aisle, his flashlight beam revealing more details that didn't add up. Fresh scratches on the metal seat frames, as if small hands had been gripping them recently. A crushed juice box on the floor, its expiration date 2 months away. A child's drawing, done in crayon on a piece of paper that was damp but not disintegrated, showing stick figures and a yellow bus and what might have been trees or flames. It was hard to tell. He reached the front of the bus and stood beside the driver's seat, looking back down the aisle. In the beam of his flashlight, everything looked exactly as abandoned as it should. Old, decayed, empty. But when he turned the light off for just a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gray daylight filtering through the dirty windows, he thought he saw something different. Movement in the seats, shapes that might have been children hunched down and hiding. But when he turned the light back on, there was nothing. Just empty seats and accumulated debris. His CB radio crackled from outside, the sound barely audible through the rain, but distinct enough to catch his attention. Someone was trying to reach him, their transmission breaking up but persistent. EPH moved quickly back toward the emergency exit, suddenly desperate to be out of the bus and back in the familiar safety of his truck. He climbed down into the rain and sloshed through the mud back to his rig, his heart pounding harder than the physical exertion warranted. He grabbed his CB handset, water dripping from his jacket onto the floor of the cab. "This is eastbound on Route 42. Someone trying to reach me?" A woman's voice came through, clearer now that he was in his truck with the radio's antenna. "This is Boyd at Central Dispatch. We got a ping from your truck's GPS showing you stopped in an unusual location. Everything okay out there?" "I'm at mile marker 18. Got a school bus in the median that looks abandoned but shows signs of recent activity. I need highway patrol to check it out. Possible stranded passengers, though I couldn't find anyone inside." There was a pause, and when Boyd spoke again, her voice had taken on a different quality. Still professional, but with an underlying tension that Efish couldn't quite interpret. "Say again? Did you say a school bus?" "Affirmative. Yellow school bus, number 1247, sitting in the grass median. Looks old and deteriorated but has fresh mud and what appears to be recent use. I heard sounds inside but couldn't locate anyone when I investigated. Another pause, longer this time. "Stand by," Boyd said. "I'm checking something." F sat in his cab with the engine idling, watching the bus through his rain-streaked windshield. Now that he was back in his truck, the whole thing felt surreal, like he'd stepped briefly into some alternate version of reality before returning to the normal world. The bus sat exactly as it had before, dark and silent, with no indication that anyone had ever been inside or that anything unusual had just occurred. Boyd came back on the line and her voice was careful, measured in a way that immediately put Eve on alert. "Driver, I need you to confirm the bus number. You said 1247? That's correct. Painted on the side panel, below the windows. Why? Because according to our records, bus 1247 was decommissioned and scrapped 8 months ago. It was involved in an accident on Route 42, approximately mile marker 18, last October during heavy flooding. The bus went off the road into the median and we had it towed to a salvage yard in November. There shouldn't be any bus at that location." Eve stared at the yellow shape in the median, feeling something cold settle in his chest. "Well, there's definitely a bus here, and it matches the number you just mentioned. Are you saying this is the same vehicle that was supposedly scrapped?" "I'm saying that's impossible," Boyd replied, but she didn't sound convinced by her own words. "Let me contact Highway Patrol and get someone out there to verify. In the meantime, I need you to stay with your vehicle and keep your doors locked. Do not approach the bus again. Do you understand?" "Understood," Eve said, though he wasn't sure he understood anything anymore. "How long until Highway Patrol arrives?" "They're dispatching a unit now. Should be there in 20 minutes, maybe less. Just sit tight." The transmission ended, and Eve was left alone with the rain and the idling engine and the school bus that shouldn't exist sitting in the median like a challenge to everything he thought he knew about how reality worked. He pulled out his phone to document the scene, taking several photos through his windshield, but the rain and the distance made the images frustratingly unclear. The bus was visible, certainly, but the details were lost in the weather and the poor lighting. He was reviewing the photos when he noticed something that made his breath catch. In one of the images, taken at a slightly different angle than the others, there was a face in one of the bus windows. Small and pale, pressed against the glass, with dark eyes that seemed to be staring directly at the camera. But when he looked up at the actual bus, squinting through the rain, he could see that particular window was empty. And when he checked the other photos, the ones taken seconds before and seconds after, there was no face in any of them. Just that one image, that one impossible moment captured by his phone's camera. Eve zoomed in on the photo, trying to make out more details, and felt his stomach turn. The face wasn't quite right. The proportions were off somehow, the eyes too large, the mouth too small, as if someone had drawn a child's face from memory without quite getting all the details correct. And there was something about the expression that disturbed him on a level he couldn't articulate. Not fear or sadness or any emotion he could name, but something else entirely. Something that suggested the face's owner was looking at him the same way he might look at an insect, with detached curiosity and no real understanding of what they were seeing. He deleted the photo immediately, an instinctive reaction he couldn't explain or justify. Then he sat in his truck and watched the bus and listened to the rain hammer against his cab and waited for Highway Patrol to arrive and tell him that everything had a rational explanation, that there was nothing to worry about, that the world still made sense in all the ways it was supposed to. Highway Patrol arrived 18 minutes later, a single cruiser with lights flashing but no siren, pulling onto the shoulder behind Eve's truck. The officer who emerged was older, maybe late 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working outdoor assignments in all kinds of conditions. He approached Eve's door, rain dripping from the brim of his campaign hat, and gestured for him to roll down the window. "You the driver who called in the bus?" the officer asked, his voice carrying the flat professional tone of someone who'd handled thousands of incidents and wasn't easily surprised by anything anymore. "That's right," Eve confirmed. "Ephraim Kincaid. I spotted it maybe 25 minutes ago, checked inside for passengers, couldn't find anyone but heard sounds that made me think someone might be in there. Dispatch said the bus was supposed to be scrapped months ago." The officer nodded slowly, his eyes moving past Eve to focus on the yellow shape in the median. His expression didn't change much, but Eve caught something. A brief tightening around the eyes, a subtle shift in posture that suggested recognition rather than surprise. "Stay in your vehicle," he said. "I'm going to take a look, then we'll talk about what happens next." Eve watched as the officer made his way through the rain toward the bus, his flashlight beam playing across the faded yellow panels. The approach was methodical, professional, the movements of someone who'd investigated countless disabled vehicles and knew exactly what to look for. He circled the bus once completely, examining it from all angles, then climbed up through the rear emergency exit just as Eve had done. The officer was inside for maybe 5 minutes, though it felt longer. Eve kept his eyes fixed on the bus, watching for any indication of what was happening in there. But the rain and the dirty windows made it impossible to see anything clearly. Finally, the officer reappeared, climbing down from the emergency exit and making his way back to Eve's truck. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his bearing that hadn't been there before. A tension that suggested he'd found something that troubled him. "Did you touch anything inside?" the officer asked once he was back at Eve's window. "Flashlight beam only," Eve replied. "Didn't move anything, didn't pick anything up. Just looked around trying to locate whoever was making those sounds I heard." "What kind of sounds?" "Children laughing. Talking, maybe, though I couldn't make out words. And footsteps like someone moving around between the seats." Eve hesitated, then added, "I know how that sounds. But I'm not making it up, and I wasn't imagining it. I heard people inside that bus." The officer was quiet for a moment, rain drumming on the hood of Eve's truck between them. "I believe you heard something," he said finally. "Question is what you actually heard versus what you think you heard. Rain does strange things to acoustics, especially with a metal structure like a bus. Wind through broken windows can create sounds that seem human when they're not. Your brain interprets those sounds as familiar patterns, voices, laughter, footsteps, because that's what makes sense given the context of a school bus." It was a reasonable explanation, one that Eve had already considered and tried to convince himself to accept. But it didn't account for everything he'd experienced. "What about the fresh mud?" he asked. "The tracks leading from the rear exit to the front, like someone had walked through recently. That's not acoustic distortion." "No, it's not," the officer agreed. "But it's also not necessarily connected to whatever sounds you heard. Could be from the tow crew when they originally came to assess the bus after the accident, or from homeless individuals using the bus as temporary shelter, or from kids exploring an abandoned vehicle they found in the median. Doesn't mean there was anyone inside when you arrived." Eve wanted to argue, wanted to explain about the backpack and the juice box and the drawing and all the other details that suggested recent, active use rather than casual exploration. But he could see that the officer had already constructed his explanation, had fit the evidence into a framework that made sense within normal parameters, and pushing back would only make Eve look unreliable or emotionally compromised. "So, what happens now?" Eve asked instead. "Is the bus staying here, or are you having it towed?" "We'll have it towed," the officer said. Should have been done months ago, apparently. Somehow it fell through the cracks in the system. Paperwork got misplaced or filed incorrectly. These things happen, especially with incidents during major weather events when everyone's stretched thin. He pulled out a notepad and started writing. I need your full name, your company information, and your destination for the record. This'll go in the report as a citizen call about abandoned property. Nothing more complicated than that. Efi provided the information, watching as the officer documented everything in neat handwriting that somehow remained legible despite the rain spotting the paper. The whole interaction felt wrong, felt like an elaborate performance designed to categorize the incident as mundane and unremarkable. But Eve couldn't articulate why he felt that way without sounding paranoid or irrational. So he kept his concerns to himself and answered the questions as straightforwardly as possible. You're free to continue your route, the officer said once he'd finished writing. We'll take care of the bus. If we need any follow-up information, we have your contact details. What about the accident you mentioned? Eve asked. The one from last October. What happened? Was anyone hurt? The officer's expression closed down slightly, becoming more formal and distant. That's part of an ongoing investigation. I can't discuss details, but I can tell you that all passengers were accounted for at the time, and standard protocols were followed. There's nothing about that incident that should concern you. Except the officer's body language suggested otherwise. The way he'd positioned himself, slightly angled so his back was toward the bus, as if he didn't want to look at it directly. The way his hand kept moving toward his radio as if he was fighting the urge to call for backup or additional support. The way his eyes kept flicking to Eve's truck, checking the windows and mirrors, making sure there was nothing behind or around them that shouldn't be there. You've seen this bus before, Eve said quietly. You knew what I was talking about the moment I mentioned it. This isn't the first call about it, is it? For a moment, the officer's professional mask slipped, and Eve saw something underneath. Exhaustion, maybe, or frustration, or the kind of weariness that came from dealing with situations that defied easy explanation. Like I said, Mr. Kincaid, you're free to continue your route. Have a safe trip to Richmond. He turned and walked back to his cruiser before Eve could ask anything else, moving with deliberate purpose through the rain. Eve watched him go, watched him sit in his vehicle for several minutes doing something on his computer or his radio, and then watched him drive away, heading south on the state route without even a final glance at the bus in the median. EPH sat in his truck for another 10 minutes, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told him to drive away, to put distance between himself and whatever was sitting in that median pretending to be an abandoned school bus. But another part of him, the part that had spent 16 years solving problems and fixing situations and taking responsibility when others wouldn't, wanted answers. Wanted to understand what he'd actually encountered and why both Boyd and the highway patrol officer had reacted with what felt like recognition rather than surprise. He pulled out his phone and called the dispatch number, getting Boyd on the second ring. This is Kincaid. Highway patrol just left. They're saying the bus somehow didn't get properly removed after the original accident, that it's just been sitting here for months and I'm the first person to report it. Does that match what you found in your records? There was a pause, and Eve heard the sound of fingers on a keyboard in the background. That's what the official paperwork says, Boyd replied. But I did some additional checking after we talked, and there's something odd about the timeline. The bus was reported as towed to salvage on November 3rd, and there's documentation showing it was processed for scrap. But then, 3 weeks ago, there was a notation in the system about the same bus number being found abandoned on Route 42. No explanation for how it got back there. No investigation opened. Just a note that it needed to be removed again. 3 weeks ago, Eve repeated. feeling his stomach tighten. Was it actually removed that time? According to the records, yes. Towed by McClellan Salvage on February 19th, signed off by the same officer who just visited you, and marked as completed. But obviously the bus is still there, which means either the paperwork is wrong or something else is going on. Who's the officer? Eve asked. The one who signed off on the tow. More keyboard sounds. Name listed is Sergeant Tolliver, first initial R. Based out of the county substation. Been with Highway Patrol for 23 years. Clean record, solid performance reviews, no disciplinary issues. He was just here, Eve said. And he acted like he'd never seen the bus before today, like this was the first time anyone had reported it. Why would he lie about that if he's the one who supposedly had it towed 3 weeks ago? Boyd was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she said finally, but I think you should continue your delivery and stay away from that bus. Whatever's going on with it, it's above your pay grade and mine. Let the authorities handle it. Except they're not handling it, Eve pointed out. They're documenting it and driving away and leaving it sitting there in the median where the next driver who comes through will see it and potentially stop to investigate, just like I did. If there's something dangerous about that bus, shouldn't someone be warning people? Warning them about what? Boyd asked, and her voice had taken on a sharp edge. That an old school bus is sitting in a median and making sounds that might be wind through broken windows? That it has some mud on the floor that could be from a dozen different sources? You said yourself you didn't find anyone inside, didn't see any actual danger. What exactly would we be warning drivers about? She was right, and that was the most frustrating part. F had nothing concrete to point to, no clear hazard that justified closing the road or putting up warning signs. Just a collection of unsettling details that added up to a feeling rather than a fact. And feelings didn't meet any standard for official action. Fine, Eve said. I'll continue my route. But for the record, I think something's wrong here, and I think people know more than they're saying. Noted, Boyd replied. Your concern is noted and will be included in the incident report. Now please, finish your delivery. The hospital's expecting that equipment by this afternoon. Eve ended the call and sat staring at the bus for another minute, trying to memorize every detail in case it mattered later. Then he released his air brakes, put the truck in gear, and pulled back onto the highway, leaving the yellow shape in the median behind him. As he drove away, he checked his mirrors obsessively, watching the bus recede into the distance, half expecting to see it move or change or reveal something that would finally make sense of what he'd experienced. But it just sat there, dark and silent in the rain, looking exactly like what it was supposed to be. An old, abandoned vehicle that had been forgotten by the system and left to rot in a median strip. Except F knew it wasn't that simple. Knew there was more to the story than anyone was willing to admit, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. He made his delivery to Richmond without incident, unloaded the medical equipment, and collected his paperwork. The hospital loading dock manager chatted pleasantly about the weather, while Eve completed his documentation, complaining about the flooding and the road closures and how the storm was making everything difficult. Normal conversation, grounded in ordinary concerns, and Eve latched onto it like a lifeline, grateful for anything that felt mundane and real. He was preparing to leave Richmond and head back south when his phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Kincaid. Mr. Kincaid, this is Luella March. I'm a nurse at County General, and I got your number from Boyd Langer at Central Dispatch. She said you might be willing to talk to me about something you saw this morning on Route 42. Eve felt his guard go up immediately. Who are you, and why would Dispatch give you my personal number? "I apologize for the intrusion," Luella said, and her voice carried genuine contrition. "Boyd and I are old friends, and I asked her to connect me with the driver who reported the bus. I need to know exactly what you saw and heard, because I think it might be connected to something that happened to my nephew last year." "Your nephew," F repeated slowly, his mind already making connections he didn't want to make. "He was on that bus," Luella said quietly. "On October 24th, when it went off the road during the flooding. He was one of 17 children being transported from an after-school program back to their homes. The bus hydroplaned in standing water, went into the median, and tipped onto its side. All the children got out safely, or so we were told. But my nephew Tommy, he was never the same after that day. He started having nightmares saying he'd left something on the bus, saying he needed to go back and get it before it was too late. F pulled into a parking lot and killed his engine, giving the conversation his full attention. What kind of something? He wouldn't say exactly, just kept insisting that he'd left part of himself there, that the bus still had it, and if he didn't get it back soon, he'd forget how to be who he was supposed to be. Luella's voice cracked slightly. He was 7 years old, Mr. Kincaid. 7. And he became so obsessed with that bus that his parents took him to therapists, put him on medication, did everything they could think of to help him process the trauma. "Where is he now?" Eve asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. "Missing," Luella said, and the word hung between them like a weight. "He disappeared 3 weeks ago while walking home from school. There was a massive search, hundreds of volunteers, police from 3 counties. They found his backpack 2 days later, sitting on the shoulder of Route 42, right at mile marker 18, right where the bus had been. 3 weeks ago. The same time the bus had supposedly been towed for the second time, according to Boyd's records. The same time it had mysteriously reappeared in the median after being scrapped months earlier. EVH felt cold spreading through his chest, felt pieces clicking together into a picture he desperately didn't want to see. "The backpack," he said carefully. "What color was it?" "Blue," Luella replied. "Bright blue, with cartoon characters on it. He'd just gotten it at the start of the school year. Was so proud of it." "Why?" F closed his eyes, seeing again the interior of the bus. The clean seat with the bright blue backpack sitting on it, looking new and out of place among the decay. "I think I saw it," he said quietly. "Inside the bus, on one of the seats." Luella made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been something else entirely. "Then he's still there," she said. "He went back, just like he said he needed to, and now he's stuck there somehow. Mr. Kincaid, I need you to tell me exactly what you experienced. Every detail, no matter how strange it sounds. Because if there's any chance Tommy is still alive, if there's any possibility of getting him back, I need to know what we're dealing with." So Eve told her. He described the sounds of children laughing, the fresh mud tracks, the drawing done in crayon, the face in the window that appeared in only one photograph. He told her about the officer's strange behavior, about the inconsistencies in the records, about the feeling that the bus wasn't quite what it appeared to be. And he told her about how when he'd been standing inside looking down the aisle with his flashlight off, he'd thought for just a moment that he'd seen children in the seats, hiding and watching him with eyes that reflected no light. When he finished, Luella was quiet for so long that F thought the call might have dropped. Then she spoke, and her voice was steady despite what must have been crushing emotional weight. "I'm going there," she said. "Tonight, after my shift ends. I'm going to that bus, and I'm going to call for Tommy, and I'm going to keep calling until I get an answer, or until someone physically removes me from the scene. Will you help me?" Every reasonable instinct Aoife possessed screamed at him to say no. to stay away from the bus and the mysteries surrounding it, to leave this situation to professionals who were trained to handle missing children and unexplained phenomena. But he thought about the blue backpack, about a 7-year-old boy so convinced he'd left something vital behind that he'd walked back to the site of his trauma and somehow never returned. And he thought about how he'd feel if it were his nephew, his child, his family member trapped in whatever nightmare that bus represented. "What time does your shift end?" he asked. 6 o'clock, Luella said. "I can be at mile marker 18 by 7, maybe a little earlier if traffic cooperates." "I'll meet you there," Eve said, making a decision he suspected he'd regret but couldn't bring himself to avoid. "But we're not going alone, and we're not going unprepared. I know someone who might be able to help us understand what we're dealing with." He thought about Tansy McCoy, about the folder full of incidents and reports she'd compiled, about her theory that roads absorbed the history of the places they crossed, and sometimes expressed that history in ways that looked supernatural, but might just be natural phenomena humans didn't yet understand. If anyone would have insight into a bus that refused to stay scrapped, that appeared and disappeared according to no logic the authorities could track, it would be someone like Tansy who studied these anomalies instead of dismissing them. "Who?" Luella asked. "A record driver who's been researching strange incidents on highways," EF explained. "She's based in a different region, but she might know someone local who tracks this kind of thing. Or she might have information that could help us figure out what's actually happening with that bus." "Okay," Luella said. "Call whoever you need to call. But Mr. Kincaid, I'm going to that bus tonight whether you're there or not, whether anyone helps me or not. Tommy is my nephew, and I'm not leaving him out there alone anymore." F understood. He'd do the same thing in her position, would move heaven and earth to find a missing family member regardless of the personal cost or the potential danger. "I'll be there," he promised, 7 o'clock. "And Luella, bring a flashlight, warm clothing, and anything else you'd need if we end up being out there for several hours. I don't know what we're going to find, but I think we need to be prepared for the long haul." After ending the call, F sat in his truck and stared at nothing, trying to process the decision he'd just made. He was going back to the bus. He was going back with the aunt of a missing child, searching for answers that might not exist, investigating a situation that Highway Patrol had already documented and dismissed. It was irrational, potentially dangerous, and completely against every principle of professional driving that emphasized staying in your lane and leaving unusual situations to the authorities. But he couldn't shake the image of that blue backpack sitting clean and new on a deteriorated bus seat, waiting for someone to come back and claim it. Couldn't forget the sound of children's laughter echoing through a supposedly empty vehicle. Couldn't ignore the growing conviction that Tommy March hadn't simply wandered away and gotten lost, but had found his way back to the place that haunted him and discovered something there that wouldn't let him leave. Ife started his engine and began the drive back toward mile marker 18, toward the school bus that shouldn't exist, toward answers that might be more terrifying than the questions themselves. Ife returned to mile marker 18 just as the sun was setting, painting the wet landscape in shades of copper and gray. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and the clouds were breaking up in places, allowing weak light to filter through. He pulled his truck onto the same shoulder he'd used that morning, positioning it so his headlights would illuminate the median once full darkness fell. The school bus sat exactly where it had been hours earlier, unchanged and unchanging, its yellow paint dull in the fading light. He'd spent the afternoon making calls and asking questions, trying to gather information that might help them understand what they were dealing with. Boyd had been reluctant to provide additional details beyond what she'd already shared, citing privacy regulations and active investigations, but she'd confirmed that Tommy March's disappearance was still classified as an open missing persons case with no strong leads. The backpack found at mile marker 18 had been processed for evidence, showed no signs of foul play, and contained only the items a 7-year-old would normally carry: a homework folder, a juice box, and a small toy truck. Eve had also tried to reach Tansy McCoy, hoping her expertise with highway anomalies might offer some insight, but her phone had gone straight to voicemail. He'd left a message explaining the situation in broad terms, asking if she knew of similar incidents involving vehicles that refused to stay removed, or locations that seemed to trap people in ways that defied conventional explanation. He wasn't sure she'd call back in time to be helpful, but the attempt had made him feel slightly less like he was walking blind into something dangerous. A car pulled onto the shoulder behind his truck at exactly 7 o'clock. A small sedan, practical and well-maintained, with a parking sticker from County General Hospital visible on the windshield. Luella March climbed out, a woman in her early 40s wearing jeans and a heavy jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She carried a large flashlight and what looked like a backpack of her own, stuffed with supplies. Eve got out of his truck to meet her, and they stood in the drizzle for a moment, sizing each other up. Luella's eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting recent tears or lack of sleep or both, but her expression was determined, focused in the way people got when they'd moved past grief into action. "Thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand. "I know this is asking a lot, especially from someone who doesn't know us, doesn't have any obligation to help." "I saw his backpack," Eve replied, shaking her hand. "And I heard those sounds in the bus. I can't just walk away from that, can't pretend it didn't happen. Besides, if there's even a small chance your nephew is out here somewhere, that he needs help, then this is the right thing to do." Luella nodded, looking past him at the bus in the median. "Has anything changed since this morning? Any signs of activity or movement?" "Nothing visible," Evie said. "But I've only been here for about 10 minutes. Highway patrol hasn't come back, and I haven't seen any other vehicles stop to investigate. It's like people drive past without even noticing it's there." "Maybe they don't notice," Luella suggested. "Maybe it's only visible under certain conditions, or only to certain people. Tommy used to say things like that after the accident, that the bus was still calling to him, that he could hear it even when no one else could. We thought it was trauma, PTSD, the kind of intrusive thoughts children develop after frightening experiences. But what if he was actually perceiving something real, something the rest of us couldn't detect?" It was an unsettling theory, one that suggested the boundary between normal reality and whatever the bus represented was more permeable than Eve wanted to believe. But it would explain some of the inconsistencies, why the bus appeared in official records as being removed, yet remained physically present in the median. Why Highway Patrol seemed to forget about it between incidents. Why Eve had been able to see and enter it while other drivers apparently passed by without stopping. "We should establish some ground rules before we approach," Eve said, pulling out his own flashlight and checking the battery. "First, we stay together. No one goes into the bus alone, no one wanders off to investigate something separately. Second, if either of us feels like something is wrong, like we need to leave immediately, we leave. No arguments, no hesitation. And third, we document everything. Photos, videos, voice recordings if we can. Whatever we find, we need evidence that other people can examine." Luella agreed, and they approached the bus together, their flashlight beams cutting through the gathering darkness. The drizzle had stopped, leaving everything wet and glistening, and the air smelled of rain-soaked earth and something else, something faintly metallic and organic that Eve couldn't quite identify. As they got closer, he noticed details he'd missed that morning in his initial investigation. The mud on the tires wasn't uniform. On the side facing the southbound lanes, it was dry and cracked, consistent with having been there for months. But on the side facing the northbound lanes, where Eve had approached that morning, the mud looked fresh and dark, still damp despite hours of sitting in place. As if the bus existed in two different time periods simultaneously, one side aging normally while the other remained frozen in the moment of the accident. "Do you see that?" Eve asked, pointing out the discrepancy to Luella. She studied the tires carefully, then moved around to examine the other side of the bus. When she came back, her expression was troubled. "The whole vehicle is like that. The southbound side looks abandoned, deteriorated, like it's been sitting here for years, but the northbound side looks almost new, like the accident just happened. How is that possible?" "I don't know," Eve admitted. "But I think it means we need to be very careful about which side we enter from and what we touch once we're inside. If the bus is somehow existing in multiple states at once, interacting with it might have unpredictable effects." They decided to use the rear emergency exit again, approaching from the northbound side where the bus looked more intact. Eve climbed up first, testing each step before putting his full weight on it, then helped Luella up behind him. The interior looked exactly as it had that morning: deteriorated seats, scattered debris, the smell of mold and decay. But now, with the sun fully set and only their flashlights providing illumination, the space felt different, more oppressive, more deliberately concealing. "Tommy," Luella called out, her voice breaking slightly on the name. "Tommy, it's Aunt Luella. If you can hear me, please answer. Please let me know you're here." Silence, the kind that felt heavy and expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm. Ive swept his flashlight beam slowly down the aisle, examining each row of seats, looking for any sign of the fresh occupancy he'd noticed that morning. The blue backpack was gone from the seat where he'd seen it, and for a moment he wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing, if stress and atmospheric conditions had created false memories that felt real but weren't. Then Luella gasped, and he turned to see her pointing at one of the windows. Pressed against the glass from the outside, visible only because of the angle of her flashlight, was a small handprint, fresh enough that condensation still clung to the edges, small enough that it could only belong to a child. "That wasn't there before," Af said, moving closer to examine it. "I checked all the windows this morning, and there were no prints, no signs that anyone had touched the glass recently." Luella was already moving toward the front of the bus, calling Tommy's name again, her voice rising with desperation and hope. Eve followed, keeping his flashlight trained on their path, watching for anything that might trip them or present a hazard. They reached the driver's area, and Luella stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth. On the dashboard, arranged in a neat line, were 3 items: a toy truck, identical to the one Boyd had mentioned finding in Tommy's backpack; a juice box, the same brand from the backpack; and a folded piece of paper that, when Luella unfolded it with shaking hands, revealed a child's drawing done in crayon. It showed a yellow bus, stick-figure children visible through the windows, and what looked like a figure standing outside, arms raised as if waving or calling. "This is his," Luella whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is Tommy's drawing style. I'd recognize it anywhere. He drew pictures like this all the time before he disappeared. Always the same image, always the bus with children inside and someone standing outside trying to reach them." "Was he drawing himself?" Eve asked. "The figure outside the bus?" "I thought so at first," Luella said. "But then one day I asked him who it was and he said it was me. He said I would come looking for him, and when I did, I needed to call very loud so he could hear me through the walls." She looked up at Eve, tears streaming down her face. He knew this would happen. He knew he'd end up trapped here, and he was trying to tell us how to find him. The implications of that were staggering and terrible. A 7-year-old predicting his own disappearance, trying to leave instructions for his rescue through drawings no one had understood until too late. EVH wanted to dismiss it as coincidence or retroactive pattern matching, the human tendency to see meaningful connections in random events. But standing in the bus with the drawing in Luella's hands and the fresh handprint on the window, dismissal felt like willful blindness. "Then we call," Aoife said. "We call as loud as we can, and we keep calling until something answers or until we're physically unable to continue." They started calling together, their voices echoing through the metal shell of the bus and out into the night. "Tommy, Tommy March, can you hear us? Your Aunt Luella is here. We've come to take you home." Over and over, taking turns so their voices wouldn't give out, maintaining a steady rhythm of sound that filled the space and pushed back against the oppressive silence. At first, nothing happened. The bus remained empty and dark, responding to their calls only with natural echoes and the creaking of metal settling. But after maybe 10 minutes of continuous calling, Eve noticed something changing. The air inside the bus was growing colder, temperature dropping rapidly enough that their breath began to fog. And the ambient sound was shifting, the natural background noise of wind and distant traffic fading away until there was only their voices, and then, gradually, another sound underneath. Children laughing. The same sound Eve had heard that morning, but clearer now, more distinct. Not distant or muffled, but present, as if the children were right there in the bus with them, sitting in seats that looked empty but somehow weren't. The laughter had a strange quality to it, not quite innocent, not quite menacing, but something in between. The sound of children engaged in a game they didn't fully understand, following rules that made sense to them but might not make sense to anyone else. "Tommy?" Luella called again, her voice cracking with emotion. "Tommy, if that's you, please show yourself. Please let me see you. I've been so worried. We've all been so worried. We just want to bring you home." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by whispered conversation too quiet to make out individual words. F aimed his flashlight toward the sound, and for just a moment, less than a second, barely long enough to register, he saw them. Children sitting in the seats, 7 or 8 of them, wearing clothes that looked wet and muddy as if they'd been playing outside in the rain. They were looking at Luella and Afe with expressions that mixed curiosity and caution, the way children looked at strangers they'd been taught not to talk to. Then F blinked, and the seats were empty again, but the impression remained, burned into his retinas like an afterimage. Small faces, wide eyes, hands gripping the seat backs in front of them. And in the third row on the right, a boy with dark hair and a blue jacket who looked exactly like the photograph Luella had shown him on her phone, the picture of Tommy taken 2 weeks before his disappearance. "Did you see them?" Luella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please tell me you saw them too, that I'm not losing my mind." "I saw them," Aoife confirmed. "And I saw Tommy. 3rd row, right side. He was there, Luella. He was looking right at us." Luella moved quickly down the aisle, stopping at the seat F had indicated. She reached out toward it, her hand trembling, and the moment her fingers made contact with the vinyl surface, the temperature dropped even further. The metal walls of the bus began to frost over, ice crystals forming in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing. And through the sudden cold, a child's voice spoke clearly, close enough that it seemed to come from right beside them. "Aunt Luella?" It was Tommy's voice, unmistakable according to Luella's reaction. She spun around, searching for the source, her flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the interior. "Tommy, where are you? I can hear you, but I can't see you." "I'm here," the voice said, and now Eve could pinpoint the location. It was coming from the seat Luella had touched, as if Tommy was sitting there but somehow invisible, present in a way that their eyes couldn't detect, but their ears could. "I came back like I said I would. I had to get what I left behind. "What did you leave behind, sweetie?" Luella asked, her voice gentle despite the terror that must have been coursing through her. "What was so important that you had to come back?" "Part of me," Tommy replied, and his voice carried a flatness that was deeply unsettling, as if he was reciting memorized words rather than speaking spontaneously. "When the bus fell over, part of me got stuck in the moment. The scared part. The part that didn't want to get up and leave because leaving meant accepting that something bad had happened. So that part stayed, and the rest of me went home. But I wasn't whole anymore. I could feel the missing piece calling to me, pulling at me, and finally I had to come back and get it." "And did you find it?" Eve asked, keeping his voice calm and level. "Did you find the part you were looking for?" A pause, during which the frost patterns on the walls seemed to shift and rearrange themselves. "I found it," Tommy said. "But now I can't leave. The scared part is stuck to this place, and when I came back to get it, I got stuck too. We're both here now, but we can't get out. The walls won't let us. The bus won't let us." Luella reached toward the seat again, her hand passing through empty air as if trying to touch a nephew she couldn't see. "Then we'll get you out," she said firmly. "That's why we're here, Tommy, to bring you home. Both parts of you. You don't have to be stuck anymore." "You can't get us out from inside," Tommy said, and his voice was fading now, becoming distant and echo-like. "You have to go outside and break the walls. But you have to be careful, because breaking the walls might break us too. We're part of the bus now, and the bus is part of us, and I don't know what happens if you separate us wrong." The voice faded completely, leaving only the sound of wind whistling through broken windows and the steady drip of water condensing on the frosted metal. Luella stood frozen, her hand still extended toward the empty seat, her expression cycling through grief and hope and determination. "We need to go outside," Eve said gently. "We need to figure out what Tommy meant about breaking the walls, about separating him from the bus. But we're not doing it randomly, not without understanding the risks. If he's somehow bound to this vehicle, if his consciousness or his spirit or whatever we want to call it has become entangled with the structure, then we need to be very careful about how we proceed." They climbed out of the bus, emerging into the night air that felt warm compared to the supernatural cold inside. F examined the exterior of the vehicle with fresh eyes, looking for anything that might explain how to break the walls without causing harm. The discrepancy between the two sides was even more apparent now. The southbound side looked like it was slowly dissolving, the metal corroding and the paint flaking away, while the northbound side remained stubbornly intact, frozen in the moment of the accident. "What if it's temporal?" Luella suggested, following his gaze. "What if the bus exists in two different time periods, and Tommy is caught in the space between them? The accident happened on the southbound side. The bus was traveling south when it hydroplaned. Maybe his scared part is stuck in that moment on that side of the vehicle, while his physical presence is trapped on the northbound side where we've been looking for him." It was as good a theory as any, and it suggested a possible approach. If the two sides represented different states of the bus, different moments in its existence, then maybe creating a connection between them would allow Tommy to move from one to the other, to complete the transition he'd been unable to finish on his own. "We need tools," Eve said. "Something to make an opening, to create a passage between the two sides. My truck has basic equipment. Crowbar, hammer, bolt cutters might be enough." He retrieved the tools from his cab, and they stood before the bus trying to decide where to start. The windows seemed like the obvious choice. Break one on each side, create an opening that connected the two temporal states. But Tommy's warning about breaking the walls carefully suggested that random destruction might be dangerous, might sever connections that needed to remain intact. Then Eve noticed something he'd missed before. at the midpoint of the bus, right where the vehicle would have pivoted when it tipped onto its side. There was a visible seam in the metal. Not a manufacturing joint, but something else. A line where the southbound deterioration met the northbound preservation, where past and present pressed against each other. If they were going to create a passage, that seam seemed like the logical place to start. He positioned the crowbar at the seam and looked at Luella. If this goes wrong, if something happens that feels dangerous or harmful, we stop immediately. Agreed? Agreed, she said. But Eve, we have to try. We have to do something. I can't leave him here, can't walk away knowing he's trapped and calling for help. F understood. He positioned the crowbar carefully and began to pry, feeling resistance at first, then a sudden give as the metal started to separate. The sound it made was wrong. Not the squeal of metal on metal, but something organic and wet, like tearing fabric or splitting skin. He kept going, working the crowbar along the seam, creating an opening that widened gradually until it was large enough for a person to pass through. As the opening grew, the temperature differential between the two sides created wind, air rushing from the warmer northbound side toward the colder southbound side. And carried on, that wind was sound. Children's voices, multiple voices, all calling out at once in a mixture of relief and fear and desperate hope. They were all in there, Eve realized. Not just Tommy, but all the children from the accident. The 17 young passengers who'd supposedly gotten out safely, but had perhaps left pieces of themselves behind. Fragments of consciousness that remained trapped in the traumatic moment. Light began to pour through the opening, not from any external source, but from inside the bus itself, as if creating the passage had released something that had been building up for months. It was bright enough to hurt, bright enough that Eve had to shield his eyes, and through the glare he could see shapes moving, small figures climbing through the opening from one side to the other, reassembling themselves, becoming whole again. The process lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt much longer. When the light faded and Eve could see clearly again, the bus had changed. The southbound side no longer looked deteriorated. It had caught up somehow, had aged forward to match the northbound side. Or maybe the northbound side had aged backward. Either way, the vehicle now looked uniform, consistent, like a normal abandoned bus, rather than an impossible object existing in multiple states simultaneously. And lying in the grass beside the bus, unconscious but breathing, were two children. Tommy March, wearing the blue jacket from Luella's photograph and the missing backpack still strapped to his shoulders, and a girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, wearing a school uniform and clutching a stuffed animal. Luella ran to Tommy, dropping to her knees beside him and checking his vital signs with practiced efficiency. "He's alive," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He's breathing. His pulse is strong. Tommy, can you hear me?" F moved to check on the girl, finding her in similar condition, unconscious but stable, showing no obvious signs of injury beyond exposure and exhaustion. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, reporting their location and the need for immediate medical attention for two children found at mile marker 18. The dispatcher asked questions he couldn't fully answer, but he gave them enough information to get ambulances rolling. While they waited for emergency services, Tommy began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, focused on Luella's face, and filled with tears. "Aunt Luella? Did it work? Did I find the missing part?" "You found it," Luella said, pulling him into a careful hug. "You found it, and you made it back. You're safe now, Tommy. You're going to be okay." The ambulances arrived within 12 minutes, their lights painting the median in alternating red and white, their sirens cutting through the night with authority and urgency. Paramedics swarmed the scene, assessing both children with professional efficiency while asking questions that Eve and Luella struggled to answer in ways that would make sense to people who hadn't witnessed what they'd witnessed. How long had the children been here? Unknown. What had they been exposed to? The elements, possibly hypothermia, circumstances that defied conventional explanation. Were there any other victims? Not that they could find, but there might be, and that uncertainty sat heavy in Eve's chest. Tommy was loaded into the first ambulance, conscious and alert but disoriented, asking questions about how long he'd been gone and whether his parents knew he was okay. Luella climbed in with him, promising Aoife she'd call once they reached the hospital, once she knew more about Tommy's condition and what came next. The second ambulance took the girl, still unconscious but stable. Her stuffed animal clutched so tightly in her small hands that the paramedics had to carefully loosen her grip to check her vital signs. Before the ambulances pulled away, Aoife managed to get the girl's description and asked the paramedics to check missing persons reports for matches. She looked like she'd been gone for longer than Tommy, her clothes more weathered, her skin showing signs of prolonged exposure that 3 weeks wouldn't fully account for. He had a terrible suspicion that she might have been missing for months, maybe even since the original accident, and that somehow she'd been overlooked in the initial count of survivors. Highway patrol arrived as the ambulances departed. 2 cruisers this time instead of 1. Sergeant Tolliver climbed out of the first vehicle, his expression transitioning from routine response to something else entirely when he saw Eve standing beside the bus. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. The look of someone who'd been expecting this call eventually and had hoped it would never come. A younger officer emerged from the second cruiser, immediately pulling out a notepad and beginning the standard documentation process. Aoife went through the sequence of events as accurately as he could without straying into territory that would make him sound unreliable or delusional. He'd returned to check on the abandoned bus. He'd encountered Luella March, who was searching for her missing nephew. They'd discovered 2 children in medical distress near the vehicle and called for emergency services. Everything else, the voices, the cold, the temporal discontinuity, the passage he'd created with a crowbar, he left out, condensing the experience into facts that would fit on an incident report. Tolliver listened without interrupting, his eyes moving between Eve and the bus, and when the younger officer stepped away to call in additional units, the sergeant moved closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "You opened something, didn't you? Made a hole in the side of the bus." It wasn't really a question, but Eve nodded anyway. "There was a seam in the metal, right at the midpoint. I used a crowbar to pry it open. The children came out after that." "Came out from where?" Tolliver asked. "The bus was empty when I checked it this morning. I went through every row, looked under every seat. There was no one inside." "I know," Aoife said. "But they were there anyway. Not in a way you could see with normal vision, not existing in the same moment you were searching, but present nonetheless. And when I created an opening between the 2 sides of the bus, between what it was and what it had become, they were able to cross over, to finish leaving." Tolliver stared at him for a long moment, and Eve couldn't read the expression on his face. Then the sergeant pulled out his own phone, scrolled through something, and turned the screen toward Eve. It showed a photograph of the girl they'd found, younger in the picture, maybe 7 or 8 years old, smiling at the camera with gap-toothed joy. The caption beneath identified her as Sarah Brenner, missing since October 24th of the previous year, last seen boarding school bus 1247 for transport home from an after-school program. "She was on the bus during the accident," Tolliver said quietly. "But when we did the head count afterward, when we verified that all the children had gotten out safely, she wasn't among them. We searched for days, combed every inch of the area, dragged the creek, checked every possible location she might have wandered to. Eventually, we had to conclude she'd somehow left the scene before we arrived, got picked up by someone, or walked away in the confusion. The case went cold after 3 months. Because she never left the bus, Eve said, understanding crystallizing. She got out physically, followed the evacuation procedure, but part of her consciousness remained trapped in the moment of the accident. And over time, that part pulled the rest of her back, the same way it pulled Tommy back. They were all supposed to be gone, all marked as safe and accounted for, but the trauma had created anchors that wouldn't release them. "How many?" Tolliver asked, and his voice had taken on a haunted quality. How many children were still in there, still trapped in that moment? "I don't know," Af admitted. "I heard multiple voices, saw several shapes when I looked with my flashlight off. Tommy said there were others, said we instead of I, when he was talking about being stuck. But whether they all got out when I opened the passage, whether some of them chose to stay or couldn't make the transition, I can't tell you. I only know that Tommy and Sarah made it through." The younger officer returned, reporting that he'd contacted the state police and they were sending a forensic team to process the scene. Standard procedure for cases involving missing children, even when, especially when, the circumstances didn't make conventional sense. Tolliver acknowledged the information, then turned back to Eve with an expression that mixed frustration and something that might have been grudging respect. "You're going to need to come to the station and give a formal statement," Tolliver said. "Everything that happened, everything you saw and heard and did, and I'm going to need you to be completely honest, even about the parts that sound impossible, because this situation is going to generate reports and investigations and questions from people much higher up the chain than me. Can you do that?" "I can do that," Eve said. "But I need to know something first. When you came here this morning and investigated the bus, did you really not see anything unusual? Or did you see it and choose not to report it?" Tolliver was quiet for so long that Eve thought he might not answer. Then the sergeant looked directly at him, and his eyes held a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I saw the mud tracks. I saw the backpack. I heard sounds that could have been wind or could have been something else, but I also saw that the bus had been scheduled for removal twice already, that it kept reappearing in this median no matter how many times we had it towed, and I made a decision. I decided that some things are above my pay grade, that some situations require expertise I don't have, and that filing official reports about impossible vehicles would accomplish nothing except making me look incompetent or unstable. So you documented it as routine abandoned property," Evie said. "Kicked the problem down the road. Hoped someone else would deal with it." "Yes," Tolliver admitted. "And that was wrong. I knew it was wrong even as I was doing it, but I convinced myself that one more day wouldn't matter, that whatever was happening here wasn't an immediate threat. Then you called it in a second time, and the March woman started asking questions, and I couldn't keep ignoring it. So here we are." The forensic team arrived, along with additional highway patrol units and someone from the county sheriff's department. The scene transformed from a quiet stretch of median into a full investigation site, with evidence markers and camera flashes and official personnel documenting every detail. EPH gave his formal statement to a detective who recorded it all without visible reaction, neither accepting nor dismissing the supernatural elements, just collecting information for a report that would eventually make its way through bureaucratic channels. By the time they released him, it was nearly midnight. Eve climbed back into his truck, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, and sat with the engine idling while he tried to process everything that had happened. He'd helped recover 2 missing children, had potentially saved their lives or their consciousness or whatever remained of them after being trapped in temporal limbo. That should have felt like victory, should have given him a sense of accomplishment and closure. Instead, he felt unsettled, hollowed out, because he kept thinking about what Tommy had said, about how he'd heard multiple voices, about the shapes he'd seen in those seats before the light had flared and the passage had opened. 2 children had come through, but how many had been inside? How many were still trapped, unable or unwilling to make the crossing, their fragments of consciousness still bound to the decaying vehicle in the median? His phone rang, and Luella's name appeared on the screen. He answered immediately. "How is he?" "Stable," Luella said, and he could hear the exhaustion and relief in her voice. "Physically, he's fine. Mildly dehydrated. Some exposure symptoms, but nothing serious. Mentally," she trailed off. "He keeps talking about the other children, asking if they made it out too, if they're safe. The doctors think it's trauma response. Survivor's guilt, maybe. But Eve, I think he actually knows. I think he's asking about specific individuals who were in there with him." "Sarah Brenner made it out," Eve said. "She's at the hospital too, I assume. But I don't know about the others. I don't know if there were others who came through or if they're still trapped." "Tommy says there were 15, Luella said, quietly. "He counted them while he was in there, recognized some of them from the accident, saw others who he'd never met, but who'd been drawn to the bus for the same reasons he was. 15 children, all caught in that moment, all unable to fully leave. If only 2 made it through the passage you created." She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. 13 children still trapped, still waiting, still bound to a vehicle that existed in a state between accident and aftermath. 13 fragments of consciousness that might fade over time or might remain indefinitely, calling out to anyone who could hear them, trying to find their way back to the world they'd been separated from. "What do we do?" Luella asked. "We can't just leave them there. We can't tell their families that we found them, but couldn't bring them home." "I don't know if we can do anything," Eve said honestly. "The passage I created worked for Tommy and Sarah, but I don't understand why. I don't know if opening it wider would help the others or if it would make things worse. And I don't know if I'm the right person to be making those decisions. This is so far beyond what I'm qualified to handle." "But you're the one who did it," Luella pressed. "You're the one who figured out how to create the opening, who made it possible for Tommy to come back. If anyone can help the others, it's you." F wanted to argue, wanted to explain that what he'd done had been part instinct and part desperation and mostly luck, that he had no special knowledge or ability that would let him repeat the process reliably. But he thought about those voices he'd heard, about the shapes he'd glimpsed in the seats, about children trapped in a moment of fear and confusion with no one coming to help them. And he thought about how he'd feel if it were his child, his nephew, his family member stuck in that liminal space. "I'll go back tomorrow," he said. "In daylight, with proper equipment and someone who understands what we're dealing with better than I do. I'll contact the wrecker driver I mentioned, see if she can come out and assess the situation. And I'll talk to Tolliver, see if Highway Patrol can keep the area secured so no one else stumbles into this without knowing what they're walking into." "Thank you," Luella said, and the gratitude in her voice made Eve's chest tight. "Tommy's asking for you, by the way. He wants to say thank you in person. Could you stop by the hospital tomorrow before you go back to the bus?" "I'll be there," Eve promised. He ended the call and sat in his truck for another few minutes, watching through his windshield as the forensic team continued their work around the bus. They were documenting it as a crime scene, collecting evidence that would be analyzed and cataloged and filed into reports that tried to make sense of something that defied conventional understanding. He wondered what they would conclude, what explanation would eventually emerge from the investigation. Prolonged exposure leading to confusion and false memories. Mass hallucination triggered by environmental factors? Something else entirely that bent the rules of reality in ways the authorities would never officially acknowledge? Boyd called as he was preparing to leave the scene, her voice tight with concern. I've been following the updates. 2 missing children recovered, both in stable condition, no indication of foul play, but circumstances remain unclear. Iffy, what actually happened out there? I'm not sure I could explain it in a way that would make sense, Iffy said. But I can tell you that school bus is more than just an abandoned vehicle. It's somehow holding on to pieces of the accident that happened last year, keeping them preserved in a way that affects anyone who was traumatized by the event. Tommy and Sarah got pulled back because they'd left something behind, and that something wouldn't let them go. And you got them out, Boyd said. You found a way to release them. I found a way to release 2 of them, Eve corrected. But there might be more. There are probably more based on what Tommy is telling his aunt, and I don't know how to help them. Don't know if what worked once will work again. Boyd was quiet for a moment. The company is going to want to know why you were at that location after your delivery was completed. Why you weren't heading back or picking up your next load. I'll do what I can to frame it as a Good Samaritan situation. A driver stopping to help with a missing persons case, but you need to prepare for questions. I understand, Eve said. And Boyd, thank you for giving Luella my number, for not dismissing this as crazy when I first called it in. I know none of this makes sense. It makes perfect sense if you accept that the world is stranger than we usually admit, Boyd replied. I've been dispatching drivers for 15 years, and I've heard enough stories about impossible things happening on lonely roads to know that there's more out there than anyone wants to acknowledge officially. Just be careful, Eve. Whatever you're dealing with at that bus, it's not done with you yet. She was right, and he knew it. He could feel the pull even now, sitting in his truck half a mile from the median, feel the weight of unfinished business pressing against his consciousness. He'd opened a door, and doors had a tendency to swing both ways. What came out could also pull things in, and he wasn't sure he understood the rules governing the exchange. EPH drove to a truck stop 20 miles north and parked for what was left of the night, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bus, not as it appeared in normal vision, but as it had looked in that moment when the light had poured through the opening, when the 2 temporal states had briefly aligned and allowed passage between them. The image was seared into his memory with a clarity that suggested he'd been changed by the experience, marked in some way that he didn't yet understand. He was still awake when dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale yellow. He made coffee in his truck's small appliance, checked his messages, and found one from Tansy McCoy, finally returning his call from the previous day. Her voicemail was characteristically direct. Got your message about the bus that won't stay removed. That's temporal anchoring, classic signs of it. Object becomes tied to a specific moment, keeps manifesting in that configuration regardless of what you do to the physical structure. Only way to fully resolve it is to address whatever's keeping it anchored, usually trauma, sometimes unfinished business, occasionally something else entirely. Call me if you want to discuss approach strategies. And Eve, be careful. Temporal anchors can be unpredictable. He called her back, got her voicemail, left a detailed message about everything that had happened, and asked if she could come to the site to assess the situation. If there were 13 children still trapped, still bound to the bus through fragments of consciousness that couldn't complete the crossing, then he needed someone with expertise beyond his own. Someone who'd studied these anomalies, who understood the mechanics of how trauma could create lasting impressions on physical locations. By 8 in the morning, he was at the hospital, following Luella's directions to Tommy's room. The boy was awake, sitting up in bed with his parents on either side, looking small and fragile in the hospital gown, but alive and present in a way that felt miraculous given the circumstances. He brightened when he saw Eve, waving with the hand that didn't have an IV attached. "You came," Tommy said. "Aunt Luella said you would, but I wasn't sure." "Of course I came," Aoife replied, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "I wanted to see how you were doing, make sure you were okay." "I'm okay," Tommy said, though his eyes held shadows that suggested otherwise. "But the others aren't. They're still in there, Mr. Kincaid, still stuck in the scared moment, still waiting for someone to help them finish leaving. You have to go back. You have to open more doors." Tommy's parents exchanged uncomfortable looks, clearly uncertain about how to respond to their son's insistence that there were still children trapped in an abandoned bus. Luella had probably briefed them on the basics, but hearing it from Tommy's perspective made it more real, more urgent, harder to dismiss as post-traumatic confusion. "I'm going back today," Eve assured him. "I'm bringing someone who knows more about this kind of situation than I do, someone who might be able to help the others the same way we helped you and Sarah. But Tommy, I need you to tell me something. When you were in there, when you were stuck in that moment, did anyone try to keep you from leaving? Did anything feel like it was holding you back deliberately?" Tommy thought about this carefully, his young face serious. "It wasn't like something was grabbing me," he said slowly. "It was more like I was connected to everyone else who was stuck there, and we were all connected to the moment of being scared. Like a web, kind of, and leaving meant breaking those connections, which felt wrong because it meant leaving the others behind. That's why I almost didn't come through when you opened the door. It felt like I was abandoning them." "But you came anyway," Aoife said. "Why?" "Because Aunt Luella was calling me," Tommy replied. "Because I could hear her voice telling me it was okay to leave, that she'd come back for the others, that I didn't have to stay to prove I cared about them. And Sarah heard someone calling her too. I think it was her grandmother, I'm not sure. But we both heard people we loved telling us to come home, and that was enough to break the connections long enough to get through." It was valuable information, suggesting that emotional bonds could override the trauma anchoring. If they could get family members for each of the trapped children, bring them to the bus to call their loved ones home, maybe they could facilitate more crossings. But tracking down 13 families, convincing them to participate in what would sound like an impossible ritual, coordinating them all to be present at the same time, the logistics were daunting. "I'll figure something out," Aoife promised Tommy. "I won't leave them there. I'll find a way to help them." He left the hospital carrying the weight of that promise, knowing he had no clear idea how to fulfill it but unable to walk away. The bus was still there, still holding pieces of 17 children who'd survived an accident physically but hadn't survived it completely. 2 had made it home. 15 remained, and somehow, impossibly, F had become responsible for bringing them back. He drove to mile marker 18 with the morning sun barely clearing the horizon and found that the forensic team had finished their work overnight. The bus sat in the median exactly as it had before, though now it was surrounded by evidence markers and yellow tape marking it as part of an active investigation. A single highway patrol cruiser remained on scene, and Sergeant Tolliver climbed out when he saw Eve's truck approaching. "Thought you might come back," Tolliver said. "The forensic team found some interesting things. Chemical traces in the interior that don't match any known compounds. Temperature anomalies that their equipment couldn't fully explain. Recording devices picking up sounds that weren't audible to human ears at the time but showed up on playback. They're classifying it as an unexplained phenomenon pending further investigation." "Which means they're going to study it," Eve said. "Bring in specialists, run more tests, try to understand it scientifically." "Which means they're going to take time we might not have," Tolliver corrected. "If there are children still trapped in there, if their consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, is gradually fading or degrading, then waiting for official channels could mean losing them permanently, I've looked at the sergeant with new understanding. You want to help, you want to go off the books and do this unofficially. I want to do right by those kids, Tolliver said. I failed them when I didn't investigate properly the first time, when I let this bus sit here for months because dealing with it officially was too complicated. I'm not failing them again. So, if you've got a plan, if you know someone who can help, I'll do whatever I can to facilitate it. I'll keep the scene secured. I'll delay the specialists. I'll run interference with the bureaucracy. Just tell me what you need. What Eve needed was Tansy McCoy, with her expertise and her folders full of documentation about similar incidents. What he needed was the families of 15 missing or altered children, willing to stand in the rain and call their loved ones home. What he needed was understanding that he didn't have, solutions to problems that defied normal approaches. But what he had was a crowbar, a commitment to help, and the growing certainty that the bus wouldn't release its hold until someone forced it to. Until someone created enough openings, enough passages, enough connections between the trapped moment and the present that the children could finally finish leaving. "Give me 24 hours, Eve said. "I'll contact everyone I can think of who might be able to help. And then tomorrow night we're going to come back here with whatever resources we can gather, and we're going to open every door we can find until everyone who wants to leave has the chance to do so." Tolliver nodded. "I'll be here, and I'll make sure no one interferes." Eve spent the rest of that day making calls, sending messages, reaching out to every contact who might have relevant expertise or resources. Tansy agreed to drive through the night to reach them, bringing equipment and knowledge she'd accumulated over years of studying highway anomalies. Boyd coordinated with dispatch to free up Eve's schedule, giving him the time he needed without asking too many questions she wouldn't want answered officially. And Luella began the heartbreaking task of contacting families, not to tell them their children were trapped in a school bus in a way that defied explanation, but to ask them to come to mile marker 18 the following evening for a memorial ceremony, a chance to say goodbye and find closure. Some agreed, some refused, but enough said yes that by the time night fell, Eve had a list of 7 families who would be present, who would call for their children and hope for an answer. It wasn't everyone. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. And as Eve sat in his truck that night, parked at the same truck stop where he'd failed to sleep the night before, he thought about doors and passages and the space between moments. He thought about how trauma could anchor consciousness to specific locations, how fear could create bonds stronger than physical distance, how love could sometimes cut through those bonds and bring people home. Tomorrow, they would try again. Tomorrow they would open more doors, create more passages, call louder into the space where past and present intersected. And maybe, probably, some of those trapped children would cross over, would finish leaving, would find their way back to the families who'd never stopped looking for them. But F suspected, with a certainty that sat cold in his gut, that not everyone would make it through. That some fragments were too deeply embedded, too thoroughly integrated with the traumatic moment to be easily separated, and that the bus would remain in that median, holding on to whatever pieces it couldn't release, waiting for the next accident, the next trauma, the next opportunity to trap consciousness in amber and refuse to let go. The road took what it wanted. The road remembered. And sometimes the road kept pieces of people long after their bodies had walked away, creating hauntings that looked like abandoned vehicles but were actually monuments to moments that refused to end. EPH closed his eyes, knowing sleep still wouldn't come, and made peace with the fact that he would carry the weight of this experience for the rest of his driving career. That every time he passed an abandoned vehicle on the shoulder, he would wonder what it was holding, what it refused to release, that he would never again be able to look at accidents the same way. Never assume that survival was as simple as walking away physically intact. The bus waited in the median. The children waited within the bus. And tomorrow, Eve would go back and try again to bring them home, knowing that trying was all he could do, and that sometimes trying wasn't enough.